Everything around was moving in the smoke of burning people and dust. The air was filled with the stench of dying bodies and ash that irritated the nose. The person's eyes did not reflect emotions. The man stood up and wandered aimlessly forward across the battlefield. Here and there, flagpoles could be seen sticking out of the ground. The wind fluttered his red cloak. The blood on the blade had long since dried. Jack kept thinking and imagining how his life would have turned out if he had found the blade earlier, if his life would have been happy in that case. Having found the blade, his sister, the first beauty of the kingdom and an innocent child, would not have been sent to the Empire, and her fate would not have mocked her so much. If only he had found the sword earlier, then he, as a bloodthirsty murderer of thousands and the death of people, would not have existed at all. I wonder what he would have been like. Or his mentor, his friend and comrade, with whom he associated a huge number of good and kind memories, the one with whom he associated his kindest moments. It was she who was the main culprit of all his knowledge, skills, and abilities. She helped him to formulate his potential and turn him into the person he is now. She is the best thing that happened to him in all his years. His strength had left him. How desperate he looked now. His long hair was stained with ash and blood. The scars all over his body were darkened. His greaves were nicked and stained with dirt. He had lost everything. He didn't want all this. He never wanted it. He was disgusted by all these endless wars, obligations. But the worst of all was the fear in the eyes of people. Everyone looked at him like a monster. Jack heard a noise. Behind him, another detachment was approaching him. This procession was led by a young nobleman. The boy's face was all sweaty from fear. Holding his sword at the ready, Jack noticed how the blade of his sword was shaking. The man felt sorry for him. The boy's hands stubbornly did not hold the sword tightly. Jack told the nobleman that he does not fight with children. The boy's trembling lips parted, and with great difficulty he told the killer that he had cut short his father's life, the boy's voice conveying his emotions and anxiety. Jack just smirked at the accusation. He had ended the lives of countless men, both from noble families and from lower classes. He did not remember the victims. The boy's eyes flashed with a furious fire. A real monster in a human body, he thought. The monster in front of him spoke about the deaths of people so calmly and peacefully that it became creepy. But now the word monster could not touch Jack's soul. The people around him and those he met uttered this word so often that it lost its meaning and did not touch him. Suddenly, streams of blood gushed from the wounds on the killer's naked chest. Jack was seriously wounded. His groan of pain echoed across the battlefield. He covered the wound with his hand. Jack felt tired, deadly tired throughout his body. His muscles were cramped with pain and spasms. His head seemed to be melting. He wanted to end it all. But, nevertheless, he wanted to wait a little, to watch this boy. The young nobleman looked at him as angrily as he did fearfully. Jack, the one who razed an entire empire to the ground, killed all the great masters and overthrew the royal family, was called a monster. He asked the young man if he knew how often his sword had tasted the flesh of men, taking their lives, how often he himself had witnessed the death of others at his own hands. The killer's face was distorted into a mad grin. His golden eyes were emitting fire. He had killed hundreds of thousands of people. And was he a monster after that? Jack mocked the nobleman. He shouldn't have been so surprised. Even greater fear ate into the boy's body. This monster in front of him was not a human. His heart seemed to be about to break his ribs and jump out of his chest from horror. Jack assessed the nobleman with his gaze. He stood with a trembling sword in his hand, dressed in expensive fabrics and looking at him with eyes full of silent horror. The boy reminded him of himself. The warrior asked the boy's name. He said Jack. Jack Stewart. What a coincidence. Today was becoming more and more interesting. Weakening with every second from the lost blood, the warrior's voice remained just as calm. Jack liked that young Stewart was his namesake. The warrior kept thinking about Stewart's words about killing his father. He kept trying to remember him, but he couldn't. He told the young man about it. Tears flowed from the young nobleman's turquoise eyes. Jack had killed too many people, and almost all of them were the same, just like Stewart's father. The dialogue between the two Jacks was emotional. Young Stewart said that although his father was not a good man, the boy missed his lost father. Such love was enviable to Jack. Jack did not apologize or justify himself for killing the nobleman's father, but he could still do Stewart a small favor. The boy became curious. Jack offered to kill Stewart. The warrior said this in a completely normal and calm tone, as if he was asking him for an ordinary request. "Kill me with this sword." These words echoed in the boy's ears. Jack's hand pointed at the blade in the boy's hands. The boy's face looked pale and surprised. Jack explained that there was no better time for Stewart than now. The warrior himself was seriously wounded. The guy could avenge his father and at the same time become famous. Although at the same time as he spoke the words, Jack thought that he could easily leave here alive. His broken bones would grow together. His body would heal. Did the guy really not want fame? But in reality, the warrior did not want all this. Thinking about it, Stuart raised his sword above his head with a battle cry and rose above the exhausted Jack, striking. The killer closed his eyes, expecting pain, but the blade only left a mark on the ground. Passing by the body, Stuart fell to his knees. He couldn't do it. The boy burst into tears in front of him. Deep down, Jack knew that the boy would not be able to take his life. Jack was surprised by the boy's behavior. The warrior knew that Stuart's intuition told him that his actions were wrong. In fact, by killing Jack, Stuart would have taken on the heavy burden of being a hero. This would lead to a life full of regret. The boy would make the same mistake that Jack himself once did. The warrior advised the boy to enjoy his youth. The demon asked young Stuart to tell everyone else that the monster was dead. And with his death, the war was over. As the surrounding soldiers watched silently, Stuart's eyes continued to shed tears. He did not understand why, despite having so much strength and colossal experience, Jack lived so unhappily and cruelly. Jack had asked himself this question before, why he lived his life the way he did, and something in the boy's question echoed in Jack's body with longing. The warrior's body fell to the ground, his strength leaving him every second. He realized that his life was finally coming to an end. This was the end. The sensations that Jack experienced at that moment were ambiguous. He felt how quickly all the life energy was leaving him, how he stopped feeling the flesh. His eyes slowly began to close. Everything before his eyes became cloudy and black. His body refused to follow his commands, although he no longer wanted anything. Everything around him ceased to exist. He slowly and gradually forgot how to breathe. His brain lost touch with reality. Stuart leaned over Jack's dying body. The moonlit night illuminated the warrior's body well. This was the last moon in the monster's life. In the end, there was nothing left around. His mind seemed to have been torn from his body. He remembered his very last thought. If only he could start all over again. Jack's soul seemed to have fallen into a pool of water. He felt peace and seemed to be sleeping. He was dreaming a long, familiar dream. In his dream, Jack's past flashed through his mind, and he saw in it an aristocratic and cold father who questioned his blood relationship with his son. The face of his mother, who died immediately after his birth, the face of his beautiful sister, famous throughout the world for her beauty, and the face of his older brother. He remembered everything. Jack Ballantyre's name was forgotten by the warrior. This man was a warrior who crossed an entire continent with his blade and determination. Still, Jack didn't understand what was happening to him now. Maybe he was killed or he just died. Maybe he was now being shown pre-death memories. The warrior reflected on his first war, which made him a cruel ruler, after which everyone around him called him a monster. He stood on a mountain of corpses, columns of ash rising into the sky. He would never forget how, driven by revenge, he destroyed the Tolkien Empire and killed everyone who bore that name. No one could oppose him, no matter what war he started or what battle he participated in. He emerged victorious every time, and yet it was easy for him to accept the approach of his death. Everything he wanted to achieve in life, he achieved. Although he regretted it, he lost the meaning of life. He finally closed the gas. When suddenly he found himself in the garden, he could not believe his eyes. There was no sense of dark magic involved here. He found himself in the past. The Ballantyre family was one of the most famous in the Tesla Empire, and its members openly showed sympathy for the emperor. Jack himself was the youngest of the Marquis Ballantyre family, besides his older brother and sister. But his title as the youngest did not suit the young man. If he had been born into an ordinary noble family, everything might have been different, and he would have been satisfied with the title. But he was born into the family of the Marquis Ballantyre. Everything was different. The garden he found himself in was overwhelmingly filled with red roses, and the boy touched one of the buds with longing. The garden itself, which contained many representatives of fragrant flora, was an extension of the Ballantyre estate. Despite its beautiful appearance, the garden was actually a place of exile, although Jack liked it there. He was apparently banished with the purpose of frightening him, separated from his family and servants, so that he would feel lonely and break down. The air was filled with the scent of roses, daisies, and orchids, and in the garden, on the white stone of the gazebo, the rays of the pleasant sun played, saturating the plants with a rich color. A male voice called out to Jack, and in the heat of his thoughts, Jack had not even heard the footsteps. The butler offered him a drink. The butler of the Ballantiers family was the only person in the entire estate who treated the boy warmly and supported him in dark times. Young Ballantier still remembered the butler's name, Ron. He remembered that there was always a little cunning in this man. Jack turned to him with a smile. The young man decided to play a joke on the butler by asking if Ron had added poison to the drink. But the question confused the butler, and he blushed and began to get indignant. Jack smiled at the man in the black tailcoat, warning Ron that it was just a harmless joke. He was grateful to the butler for all his kindness. The tomato drink cooled Jack down pleasantly on this hot day. But besides Jack himself, there were 11 other people in the garden. One of them was the butler, who sheepishly thanked Jack for his warm words. As he was leaving, the boy noticed a smile on Ron's face, and his heart felt good. The remaining 10 were members of the guard, whose job it was to look after young Ballantier. The guards in full knightly armor seemed part of the garden. But for Jack, among them all, only Ron had value. For the boy, the butler was his only friend. The youth was thinking about a plan for further action. The nobleman came to the conclusion that everything that was happening to him now was real. He did not think that he would be able to return to the past. An hour had passed since his arrival. Jack Ballantier wasn't going to miss this chance. Going back to the past was a chance to correct all his mistakes, or rather, not make them at all. At the time of his death, he was only 14 years old and had plenty of opportunities. It was strange to look at his hands and not notice the scars from endless battles. And he also didn't feel even the beginnings of mana. If we were to draw an analogy with other children from noble families, Jack was the weakest of them all, which was very unpleasant. The main reason for his weakness was the lack of mana that had not formed. The creaking of the hut's floorboards could be heard, and a heavy shadow fell on the boy. The blow to the head still echoed in his ears. The pain Jack felt at that moment pierced his entire young body. A very long time had passed since the last time someone dared to hit him on the head. Jack cursed, "Even animals at a watering hole do not touch each other, and the lion is one of them," or his brother was not aware of such information. The tall, dark-haired boy demanded respect from the boy, dressed in a blue suit with gems on the shirt. His older brother's face twisted in disgust. His older brother, Pelon Ballantier, was the second child in their family, 3 years older than Jack himself, and had no love for his younger brother. The main reason for the boy's lack of magic was right in front of him. Due to Pelon's constant bullying, Jack was unable to practice magic. Even after a decade, his older brother still provoked the anger and infuriated the young man. His arrogance and constant bullying were forever imprinted in the young nobleman's memory. Pelon never held back from cursing and humiliating Jack, and he told him he could kill him at any moment, for the youngest of the Ballantiers was useless. At his age, he didn't know how to control magic. He didn't even have it. And he also didn't know how to wield a sword, unlike their sister. And if suddenly his younger brother takes a risk and learns magic, then Pelon will consider it a betrayal and will still kill Jack, he said, pouring the contents of the cup on his brother's head. The older brother demanded absolute obedience. He did not want to see or hear Jack and demanded that he behave quietly and also accept and tolerate everything that was done to him. And then let the younger brother do whatever he wants. No one knows how it will all end. The only reason Jack was alive was because the Marcus blood was in his veins. Only when Pelon becomes the head of the family after his father's death, then perhaps he will accept Jack as his younger brother. Jack remembered that because of his weakness he could not defend himself in any way. For his age, the boy was in many ways weaker than his peers. This served as a pretext for mockery and ridicule from other family members. And as a result, the servants also did not respect him and were aware of his weakness. The people around him, even those of such a low rank as a maid or a cook, constantly mocked him, without even trying to hide it. But in many ways, the culprits of the daily persecution were the spreaders of rumors, who were his brother and Count Mentis. But despite this, the sight of his older brother made the young man laugh, because no matter what he did, his sister remained the eldest child in the family. She was the only person in the family he could rely on or trust. She was the only one out of all his relatives who cared about him. His older sister was a year older than Pelon, but unfortunately for the boy, she could not become the head of the family because of her gender. Her fate, as the daughter of the Marquis of the Ballantier family, was determined from the moment of her birth. The fate of the Marquis's daughter is predetermined. She will marry the one her father likes and will live her entire life in a small estate, giving birth to heirs. The boy stands frowning and looks at his older brother with great hatred. Before him stands the one who contributes most to making sure that his sister's life is and will be like this. The boy's hand clenches into a fist in rage, because this is the one who is ready to sell her to the first person he meets in order to quickly take the place of the heir. If he kills him, he will be doing the whole world a favor. because a man thinks of no one but himself. The older one swings at his brother. He didn't like the way he looks at him. Unlike previous times, Jack intercepts the elder's hand, preventing the blow. The guy's look is confident. He grabbed tightly and is not going to let go. The elder does not understand how he dared to do this. But that wasn't the end. Jack made a dash and, dragging the huge body towards himself, threw it over his back. The boy's face mocks the situation. He lets out a sarcastic phrase, humiliating his brother. Rage fills the elder. He reaches for his sword and his body begins to blaze with fire. The servants standing aside decide not to approach so as not to get hurt themselves. The elder begins to collect mana. Of course, they're not going to stop them. So Jack takes a confident stance. Suddenly, their butler Ron appears in front of them, covering the baby with his back, and asks the master to stop and not use mana now. In response to the request, the gentleman does not react, but hits him in the face for daring to interfere with him. The blow was so strong that the butler fell to the floor. Jack does nothing about it. For him, there is no point in it. He stands there smirking as he watches what's going on, but he doesn't help. Ron has a lot of his own secrets. The elder's cries spread throughout the area. He reports that Jack is a vile spawn and he will die along with his butler. He is interrupted by Jack's mockery, smiling as he pretends to clean his ear, and jokes that the elder one wants to stun him. Veins began to appear on the elder's face. Jack did not expect this, but he drove him so crazy that he decided to draw his sword. It doesn't matter that his body doesn't know what training is and hasn't been able to open up his mana. He's not going to lose. The elder swings his sword around himself, his teeth clenched and his eyes filled with confusion. But the magic of the third circle is his limit. No matter how expensive the sword he uses, he is still a child. Jack equips his skills and passes under the blade. The boy's actions are abrupt and unreadable. He cannot be defeated with such fencing techniques. He gets as close to his elder as possible, creating a perfect opportunity to kill him now, but he refuses it. Smiling smugly, Jack whispers in his ear to visit a doctor and get his head treated, which is considered humiliating. To use the third circle of magic, you need to fill your entire body with mana, including your head. Jack lunges forward, grabs his wrist, and stretches his other hand forward, covering the elder's face with his palm. His eyes sparkled. He was ready to take revenge on his brother for every mockery of himself with 100 of his own. At the last second, his face twisted in rage and he fell to the floor unconscious, causing the younger one to poke him with his foot, checking if he was even alive. One of the servants reaches out to draw his knife, but Jack orders him to hold still unless he wants to end up like his master. After praising his obedience, he grabs his older brother by the hair and starts to drag him somewhere, dragging his body along the floor. Stopping near a fountain filled with water and saying that it is a bit hot today, Jack wishes to generously help his older brother to cool off. He nonchalantly dunks his face in the water until he starts to choke. How shocked the elder must be if he doesn't even use the mana he's been saving up so diligently. Jack doesn't let him escape and continues his mockery, because if you think about it, it's because of him that a lot of things went wrong. Immediately after he sent his elder sister to the Empire, he mercilessly poisoned his own father. He himself became the head of the family and tried to influence the affairs of the Empire, as if he had the right to do so. The result is clear to everyone. The house of the Marquis de Ballantier was destroyed and wiped off the face of the earth. Jack remembers what happened with regret, but he doesn't care about revenge for his father and their home. He only felt sorry for losing the opportunity, the one that their sister gave them at their wedding, and it causes anger, making the guy grit his teeth. Their sister has always been very smart and has a pleasant character. Everyone spoke well of her. It was so painful for her to leave her home. Jack could hardly imagine the feelings that overwhelmed her. She went to another empire to ensure her family's good reputation. She was filled with horror. Elizabeth knew what she was getting into because her fiancé was not an ordinary man. He was the fourth prince who had terrible rumors about him, but she was not his legal wife, so no one would come to see her. Just looking at his face, Elizabeth was overcome with fear. He ordered her to stand quietly, nod when asked, and not forget to smile. For the sake of her family, she was ready to do anything, even such a relationship. If only her father and brother knew what she really felt like then. But it's worth stopping. The more Jack thinks about it, the angrier he gets, so he can finish off the elder right here. The elder, still in his arms, burst into tears and begged for mercy. He looked at his younger brother with hope for life. On his face, one could see sheer horror, and it reminded Jack of something. In his past life, when he killed people, such grimaces of fear of death were encountered all the time in the war. Jack clutched the lock of hair tighter in his hands and began to slowly lower his brother to the ground, asking him to think carefully about everything he had done to him. Bending his face over the water again, he warns that if he is having trouble thinking, he can help him remember. Or is it better to let the older one experience everything on his own skin so that he understands the importance of family ties? Jack mercilessly swings his fist at him and is about to hit him, even though he has already admitted his guilt and asks him to stop. He is distracted by the butler Ron, who is watching everything from the gazebo, and he asks the young master to stop bullying him. But his word means nothing to Jack. Thinking for just a second, he ends up knocking his brother's head out on a rock. Having thrown the elder one to the ground, he turns to the servant and asks him to clean up, or rather, to take away his still living brother. While the worried servant rushed to help, Jack rubbed his hands and calmly left there. As they pass the butler, they bump shoulders, and Ron realizes that the young master has changed, that confidence and courage are trembling in him, and that the house has learned about what happened. The lady fell unconscious at the sight of her son. This turned everything upside down, because Pelon Balantier, the future heir, who is supported by the forces of the influential family of Count Mentis, was defeated. So, it is natural that in a family where it was expected that the title of Marquis would naturally pass to Pelon, the sight of his broken head and his newfound fear of water created a total commotion. There were many rumors. Pelon got the third circle at 17, and at such a young age it is a miracle how the younger one could defeat him. Also, the maids whispered that you, my dear YouTube viewer, are really watching my video. These young maids just dream of serving you. So do not forget to leave a comment, like and subscribe, and they will definitely come to you in a dream to help you in all your affairs. See you later, my beloved subscribers. They said that he was not trained in magic or fencing. Why did he have to hide his skills, and why did he show them only now? Pelon would be 18 next year and would be introduced as the official heir. But now that the younger one had shown his claims to the place of head of the family, nothing had been decided in advance. Pushing the servant and squeezing between the crowds, Elizabeth appears, asking to tell what actually happened. The rumors began to spread further and further, and many in the estate came up with new details about what had happened. 2 servants are ordered to call the third. The head of the family is waiting for him. He is gloomy and menacing. Jack, not thinking about how the head of the family will react, eats the delicious dessert, praising it along the way. Suddenly, the maids burst into the room and give Ron information that the owner wants to see the young master right now so that he can notify him. Tiredly, Jack rises from his chair and throws on his jacket, heading for the door, but is followed by Ron's shouts that he should come with him. The guy stops his butler, saying that he is no longer a baby who needs to be protected and he can handle it himself. A look of disappointment crossed Ron's face, but he dared not disobey and only asked him to come back quickly. A bunch of eyes look at Jack walking through the castle. He feels each of them, realizing how long ago these sensations appeared the last time. These feelings, when for those around him it's as if he doesn't exist, even though the corridor is filled with servants. It doesn't matter what others think about him. The main thing is that it ends soon, and he reaches out his hand to open the door. But the knights forbid him entry. They pretend that he is not here. He considers this stupid, turns to the knight, and when he ignores it, he starts kicking him, calling him blind or dumb. In response to such actions, he looks menacingly at the boy through the narrow slit of his helmet, and in the past he would have immediately run away from such a look. But not now. Smiling sweetly, Jack sternly tells him to relax his expression before he splits it in half. When he ignores him, he hits him again, but with all his might, and the knight falls to his knees. Jack says that he won't repeat it twice, the Marquis called him. But then why is there such a discrepancy? Jack asks. Why he won't let him in? The knight rises abruptly and, stuttering slightly, says in a commanding voice that he cannot answer. Rubbing his chin, the guy understands what it means that he needs to wait. To the knight's surprise, Jack turns around and leaves. There is no point in him standing and waiting. He is nobody here anyway. Jack asks where they think he should go, and is left perplexed by the question. He asks to convey that since the Marquis wants to talk so much, let him come himself. Why call him and not let him in? The knights decided that he had gone crazy. The servant apologizes and tells the Marquis that he has left, which brings a satisfied grin to his face. Having correctly noticed that the youngest has changed a lot, he puts aside his paperwork and gets up from his seat. Jack takes a bench on the street. At one point, he begins to hear the sound of footsteps. It is the Marquis walking towards him with the mistress and the servants. The boy knew that everything would happen like this. Noticing him from afar, he looks at his father. Even from his face, it is clear that he is an old, stubborn donkey. Surprisingly, he remembers it exactly the same, despite the fact that he actually saw it many years ago. Sometimes Jack tries to think that he doesn't exist at all. In a past life, the Marquis tried to kill him for trying to run away from home. In fact, the Marquis is a man who is capable of selling his child for the sake of his reputation. too greedy for power and too incapable of achieving what he wants. Without rising, he greets the man. Such as the Marquis Balantier, why would he call this creature father? He frowns thoughtfully as he looks at his youngest son and asks him what's wrong, but gets a meaningless answer. The lady standing behind him started to shout, how dare he treat the head of the family like that? Swinging his leg casually, the guy asks the Marcus if he wants to go inside or if they can talk right here. With a wave of his hand, he throws the saucer off it. It doesn't fly for long and eventually breaks. Flames form around the Marquis and begin to rush towards Jack. Most likely he is trying to check if he has a mana heart. Of course, the old man doesn't find him because he's not here now, but he notices the guy's talent for martial arts. It is impossible to answer that he has become weaker to the question of why Jack did not show himself earlier. So in response, he lets out a meaningless phrase. The lady is furious that at such a young age he dares to behave so arrogantly, and they hold her hands so that she does not run into the guy. The hand gesture stops her. She does not dare to disobey her husband, and he is interested in such behavior of his youngest son because he thought that he was completely useless, but it turns out that he is not. This phrase hurts the boy because it means that since he is useless, he is not worthy of being called his son. An indifferent look watches the third, who bends down to place the glass on the ground, and is asked if he wants the Marcus to acknowledge him as his son. But Jack is not interested in someone's confession. The old man turns around, saying that he understood the younger one, and leaves under the whispers of the servants. Continuing to remain in place, he watches everyone leave and does not understand why he came at all. Remembering the second one's mother, he shouts taunts after her that, after what happened to his son, many wrinkles appeared, and it would be worthwhile to take better care of his skin. Her face is flushed with anger at such concern. She almost breaks her fan because of this little rascal. A smile appears on Jack's face. He is certainly not a pervert, but it is very pleasant to look at her face. Rising, he bows and asks to convey his deepest apologies to the second. The butler's menacing voice announces that Jack Ballantyre, the family's third child, is sentenced to solitary confinement for 20 days for causing a disturbance in the house. But suddenly he becomes confused and asks Jack what happened while he was away. But in response, he receives a request to keep quiet. While painting something on the easel, Jack says that Ron stood quietly while the other one was bullying him. So why is he angry now? The boy stopped drawing for a second and thought about how interesting solitary confinement was. He had already been sent to the Rose Garden, and now this too, Ron thought. There was only a month of vacation left at the academy. What was the point of this conclusion? Jack froze in confusion. He completely forgot about studying, because he had been living another life for a long time, not thinking that he would return back. He is 14, which means he must attend the Imperial Academy. All aristocrats of the Tesla Empire must study there, unless you are disabled. Then it is mandatory. The course lasts 4 years and begins at the age of 14, so Jack is now in his first year. The first semester was over, which meant that summer holidays had begun, and he felt awkward about being a student again. His tutor is directly connected to the academy. He can skip any subject, but not hers. Jack will no longer quarrel with the Marquis over trifles. He will go to the academy. There are 27 days of vacation left, 20 of which will be spent in prison, and it is a 6-day journey from here to the academy, which means he is sending him off to study immediately after prison. Let it be his past, it is difficult for him to understand himself. Ron looked tiredly, asking if the boy was finished. Jack stood up from his chair and touched the easel, intending to show it to his butler, and at the same time inquired where his imprisonment would take place. To this question, Ron expressed regret. With his whole appearance, there is only one place for imprisonment. It was for criminals who had committed crimes on the Marquis' property, and this stunned Jack. Uncertainly, he decided to confirm his guess that it was a prison, and received a positive answer. A disgruntled cry erupted. The guy didn't think that everything would be so bad and wasn't going to leave it like that. To tell the truth, the academy holidays are not only for relaxing. You can understand this even looking at Palon, whose head was broken. Almost every day from the start of the holidays until his head was smashed in, he attended social events, meeting with other aristocrats and noble families. Jack had never had this happen before, and the Marquis's affairs certainly didn't interest him. But what his relatives said infuriated him. They said that not here or anywhere else there would be no place for him. But now he sits in prison, chained by the leg. The boy decided to go to prison himself, without waiting for the guards to send him, so as not to humiliate his dignity. It was hard to tell from the crying face of Ron, who watched him go, how much pain he was in. Tears flowed like hail. He brushed them away with a handkerchief and watched them go like a pitiful kitten. Jack was different from the other prisoners in some way. Namely, he had a bed, a toilet, and 3 meals a day. But what's the point when the boy is sitting in a small, cold brick room with an annoying fly buzzing around him? The blankets there haven't been changed for half a century, and even the flies refuse to eat the soup. The boy sits leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. There is too much time for thinking, and it is too much. Aristocrats who own landed estates can punish the inhabitants as they wish, using local laws rather than imperial ones. In fact, on their territory, aristocrats have the same rights as the ruler of the empire. Jack may be imprisoned by the Marquis, but he is still his son, an aristocrat. It would be fine if the guy had rebelled against him, but why did he have to go through all this torment? Well, or maybe he is trying to console his elder in this way. I wonder if the Marquis uses poison or forbidden artifacts as an excuse for the public, although this is too much. Surely the Marquis came up with a good story to justify the second one. For example, that Jack Ballantyre is a disgrace to the family, having learned forbidden magic because of his greed. The noble elder brother noticed this and had to do something. When his brother caught him doing this and ordered him to stop, Jack not only disobeyed but did even worse. He dared to use it on his brother so that he wouldn't dare tell him what to do. And even though Palon was seriously hurt, he found the nobility in himself to forgive his foolish younger brother. Surely such a scenario has already matured in the minds of the Marquis and the Marquise. It's sickening to even think about it. But it would be fine if they kept him here for a couple of days, but the boy doesn't want to spend the entire vacation in captivity. He doesn't care about this place. He can run away right now, but he won't do it for 3 reasons: his sister, Ron, and his mentor. Besides, Jack is back in his old body. He is just a 14-year-old little boy with no muscles and too weak to survive on his own. He knows the rule of survival in this world. The strong devours the weak, the strongest survive, and the weak become food or die. He doesn't want to start a bloody massacre like in his past life, but he still needs to take revenge on many people. This will require 2 things: time and power, and these can be obtained at the academy. By training, Jack can gain more influence and buy time to regain his former power. If he succeeds, he will protect his loved ones, namely his sister, his mentor, and Ron. Then, to achieve this, you need to take back what is rightfully yours, even if the guy doesn't like it. Little by little, mana began to form in his hand. There are 10 levels of magic mastery in total. The first and third circles are for beginners in learning magic, the fourth and sixth for experts, and the 7th and 9th for those who have mastered magic at the highest level. And the 10th circle is for people who are called masters or supermen. Jack presses his palms to his chest and slowly creates a blue glow, and it's even good that there's no one here. It takes 2 hours to create the first circle, and at that age he is a complete weakling. In his past life, he began studying mana at the age of 17, raising his hand up and letting it fly above himself. But immediately he starts waving his arms. No one should know what he is doing here. A strange sound is heard from the corridor, similar to the sound of the Marquise's shoes. Has she really arrived? Jack wrapped himself in a blanket and pretended to be asleep, but he heard that the sound was not as heavy as usual. This voice that he heard was of a man whom he could only see in his dreams in his past life. His tearful sister, Elizabeth Ballantyre, held her hands through the bars to his face and asked excitedly if the boy was hurt. Tears rolled down his eyes. His beloved sister was still as beautiful and kind at heart. She addressed him affectionately as Jackie, a name he had not heard for so long. Pressing her hand to his face, he smiled with happiness and reassured Elizabeth that he was not hurt and everything was fine. In a gentle voice, she asked why he used black magic when she could have taught him regular magic. Their hands intertwined. She says that she is sorry, and that Jack should have stayed at the academy instead of returning home. His face froze, which made his sister worry. She, slightly shouting, asks if everything is okay, and he listens to her at all. Wiping away his tears, Jack began to smile, happy that this was all happening for real. But suddenly he calms down, and sitting down more comfortably on the floor, he seriously calls out to his sister. Jack asks if she wants to run away, perhaps to a small village and work together in the fields. But Elizabeth sternly repeats his name. The kid continues that he knows how the second and his mother treat her. It is better to leave everything behind and live in a quiet place, find a man who will love her. He continues his speech about how long one can remain under the oppression of the Marquis. But he is interrupted by the cry of his sister. Elizabeth asks him not to say that because he is their father, and no matter what happens, he will always remain so. Jack rubs his shoulder out of awkwardness, and his sister continues that he loved their mother, and that this love is what gave birth to them, so one cannot speak badly of him. She knows how her father treats him and she will try to change it, so it is worth being a little patient. But he doesn't remember. In a past life, she said the same thing, even though her whole appearance radiated sincerity in her words. Jack really did return to his past after death, and how wonderful it was to see his sister again. While the girl is touched by his words, the guy gets up and asks her to move away from the bars a little. When she does this, he is satisfied with her position and gathers mana in his hand. The sister is shocked by what she sees, because Jack touches the cold bars with his hand and knocks out the lock. Slowly opening the cage gate, the little boy comes out, and his sister asks how he mastered the circle. But, ignoring the many questions, Jack comes up and hugs the girl tightly, apologizing to her. This makes me even more worried. My brother's behavior is very strange. Elizabeth holds the guy by the shoulders, asking if he is sure that everything is okay with him. Jack and his sister stood hugging in the middle of the cell, young Ballantyre trying to persuade his sister to escape from this cursed place and be happy. Jackie could give this person, the most precious person in his life, a calm and peaceful life. He remembered his sister's fate. Tears flowed from his eyes like a stream. They would not have to return again. It was only necessary to turn to the memories of a past life, as Jack remembered that he was soon to meet the fourth prince. The fourth prince took his kind sister in the past. The girl at that moment did not understand that she was going straight into the mouth of the beast. None of them knew. It is what this prince will do that will forever change Jack himself, outlining his life into before and after. It is he who will make the youngest of the children. The Marquise is a real monster. Jack remembered how he found this representative of the Tolkien Empire. He was caught and locked in a dungeon, all his limbs tied to a torture board. This man made the life of his beloved sister a complete hell. That day, young Ballantyre's face burned with anger and desire for revenge. His hatred towards the prince was so great that those emotions and memories of that day were fresh. He will never forgive the Tolkien Empire for what they did, nor anyone else in it. He will take revenge on everyone in the Empire, and he will start with the prince lying before him. In the past, he left his home at the age of 17. But for another 10 years after that, any news that reached him about his home and the events that took place in it indicated that nothing had changed there. One after another, each noble family of the Tolkien Empire was cast into the depths of hell, and in the end, all that remained of the once powerful noble family of Ballantyre was its formal existence on the map of the world. After the defeat of the Tolkien Empire, all power and sphere of influence was concentrated in the second largest and most powerful empire, the Teslan Empire. As already mentioned, some of the Marquise's children were still alive, which is why the Ballantyre's house actually existed. His sister was still alive at the time when she learned of her family's capture, and although her life had become a living hell, she never lost her kind heart until her death. The eldest of the Marquis's children fell to her knees before her husband, the fourth prince, begging him to spare her and save her family. But she was only met with a cold gaze. But in reality, she had no rights, not even the most insignificant ones. Her position was equal to that of a concubine, and she was treated accordingly. No matter how much she tried to persuade the emperor and the prince, no one even tried to listen to her, and they all rejected her request. But she was not going to give up. Elizabeth, Jack's sweet and innocent sister, spent the next few days begging the court to spare and free her family members, and she was willing to do anything to achieve this. For 3 days and 3 nights, the emperor's palace was torn apart by Elizabeth's pleas for help. The rain hid her tears. Wet and swollen from tears, she kept the hope for mercy. In the end, this bore fruit, and the emperor decided to listen to her request and come to meet her. So everyone said, the emperor's generosity was boundless. This is how everyone, not only in the empire but throughout the continent, knew this story, because the real truth was much more cruel. But the true story of Elizabeth of the Ballantyre's house was known only to Jack. He remembered the horrors that lay behind the words about his sister's readiness for anything. That day, having learned of the imprisonment of her family, Elizabeth asked the fourth prince for help, who came to meet her. Her happiness knew no bounds, but her joy was short-lived. The prince leaned over her like a mountain and reminded the girl that his power was enough to wipe out her entire family, and she was obliged to obey him. The prince warned the Marquise's child that as long as she obeyed all his orders, her family would be safe, and the prince would not hesitate to manipulate her. From that very day, Jack's sister turned into a real living toy for any palace intrigues and lustful fantasies. The emperor and prince were cruel in their sadism. Naturally, in this situation, the real and legal wives of the emperor and princes did not stand aside, choosing not her side. The subsequent time and everything that happened to Elizabeth made Jack's blood boil in his veins. His sister was doomed in the emperor's palace. Naturally, like every toy for a child, Elizabeth became a useless, broken toy. The fourth prince lost interest in her. And from that time on, poor Elizabeth was chained by the neck to a dark room like a pet dog, becoming a hostage in the barn. After these events, the Ballantyre house was overthrown and destroyed completely, and the already adult Jack managed to gallop only to the charred remains of what was once the estate. And then the feeling of revenge was forever ingrained in the soul of the youngest of the Ballantyres. Then, for the sake of revenge, he became a monster, vowing to destroy the Tolkien Empire and kill everyone associated with them. First, he killed the Empress in agony. Then, one after another, the cold steel tasted the flesh of the princesses, the wives of the third and fourth princes. But Jack did not stop there. Driven by revenge, he tortured to death all the families that supported them, as well as distant relatives of those killed. Monster Jack was not willing to stop until every single Tolkien, and everyone even slightly connected to them, was put to the sword and fire. The young man recalled this whole bloody story of his life. Standing opposite Elizabeth in the dungeon, he realized that this could not happen again. His sister told her younger brother to take care of his health, and she would talk to her father. Only at that moment did Jack realize how much he missed her smile. He asked her not to worry. He would do everything that was required of him, this time for sure. As Elizabeth walked up the stairs of the mansion at night, she kept thinking about her brother's behavior. He had changed so much. In the past, Jack would have silently endured everything. She wondered if it was for good or not. There was a confidence and strength in her brother that she had not noticed before. But she couldn't get the idea out of her head that her brother hadn't just used a random black magic spell, but that he had done it with skill. She herself had sixth circle magic. Perhaps for this reason she did not feel the slightest trace of magic. But her father had the seventh. Everything was ambiguous here. Standing in front of the door to her father's apartment, she decided that these were all the words of the Marquise. The girl gathered her courage and prepared to meet her father. Entering the chambers, her father was sitting over a cup of tea. She did not hesitate and asked her father to release Jack from prison, using the fact that he did not study black magic. Everyone knew about Jack's weakness. He didn't even have the rudiments of magical art, and there was no talk of learning such complex magic. Saying this, she of course understood that her father knew the truth, but did not want it to become known to the public. Her father had no equal in ambition. Elizabeth noted that Jack was not chasing the title of head of the family. Her father liked her speech, and with a smirk on his face, he ordered her to continue. She understood everything in an instant. This was not just a punishment for her brother. It was a warning for herself. What would happen if she did not obey? Her father noted her intelligence. She guessed it herself. The eldest of the Ballantyres had long understood her sad fate. She was destined to be a toy, which her father would sell to increase the power of the house. And what happened was a lesson for the future for her. The girl pursed her lips and shuddered. Just the thought of such a life tormented her heart with despair. Her father was a practical and observant man. He saw that his daughter loved and appreciated her younger brother, and she was afraid to imagine what he would do to him if she did not obey. She was brought out of her thoughts by her father's voice. Jack had no place in their family, and he was going to announce his death when he came of age, sending him away from their home with a fictitious name. Elizabeth could not believe her ears. Such a prospect of life for her brother meant that he would live, but only as long as she remembered her duty. But the father found it strange that, having the third circle, his youngest son was able to defeat the owner of the second. Having said this, Elizabeth was surprised that Jack had a circle at all, but he decided that this matter was not particularly worthy of his attention, and, looking askance at his daughter, he allowed Elizabeth to release her brother. The daughter responded to this act of mercy with a respectful bow and left her father's chambers. After this meeting, she was once again convinced that everything was predetermined. Having closed the door, her legs could not hold it. She still remembered Jack's offer to run away. No, it was impossible to run away from one's fate, she decided, and burst into tears of despair. The sun's rays illuminated the body of the young nobleman, waking him up. The night turned out to be restless because of yesterday's events, he dreamed of his past life. Jack was beginning to think that his very presence in the dungeon was giving him nightmares. Dressed in a shirt, he decided to stretch his legs. The sharp sound of metal hitting stone indicated the approach of a guard, who unceremoniously and rudely informed the younger Ballantyre of his release. Jack did not like the guard's frivolous treatment of him, but he decided that this was not enough to provoke him and to spite him. He replied that he was sorry to leave such a nice place. The guard held his things in his hands. Jack politely thanked him for handing them over. He reached his hands towards his trousers, but the guard did not give the thing back, looking into his eyes with irritation. Such impudence and disrespect for Jack, as the youngest son of the Marquis Ballantyre, irritated him. The prison guard brazenly replied that he had no shoes for Jack, and in order to stop annoying him with questions, this fact and the informal address to the upper class outweighed the nobleman's calm. Jack was overcome with anger. He asked the guard if he was the guard's friend. Such pressure from the usually cowardly Jack confused the guard. He did not know what to answer. The guard began to apologize in fear, but it was too late. The younger Ballantier focused streams of magic on his fists and lunged at the guard's head. Jack decided to teach him a lesson and remind him how to treat his master, but the warrior could do nothing to resist him. The third Ballantier was calmly strolling in the garden when Ron came out to meet him. The butler was worried about his master and was pleasantly surprised by his release. Ron ran up to Jack and began to examine him for wounds. The butler was very worried about his master because he knew how everyone felt about him. Ron's gaze fell on the drops of blood dried on Jack's shirt. The butler was unstoppable in his outburst of care and concern, but Jack replied that it was not his blood. The young gentleman heard a noise in the garden and noticed a large number of guards. He asked Ron about it, and he replied that in addition to the usual 10 guards, an Iron Blood Knight had arrived. Jack assessed the mighty armor and the warrior himself, coming to the conclusion that he felt sorry for him. It was unlikely that the plans of a warrior in his prime were those of a nanny. It was sad for him to watch how such a warrior, at the height of his power and in his desire to become famous throughout the continent, would look after him. The knight was talking to the guards when his face suddenly turned pale and took on a marbled hue. Jack guessed that he knew the reasons for his former imprisonment. A mighty golden-haired warrior approached them with his butler, while respectfully addressing Jack as the third gentleman. The knight bowed to Jack and asked young Ballantier to tell him. If it was not too much trouble what had happened in prison, the boy was in shock. The knight's interest was due to the fact that one of the prison guards claimed that Jack had attacked him. He had gouged out the impudent fellow's right eye and broken his finger. Having witnessed this strange conversation, the butler did not believe the knight's stories about Jack, for he had no reason to do such things. The knight replied that he wanted to know the reasons, for Jack had no right to do this to the guard. The guard's voice betrayed his excitement. Jack was irritated by this knight. It was inappropriate for him to use the word right in such a situation. Young Ballantier decided to dot all the I's. To begin with, Jack used his magical vision to assess the knight's circle level, and after analyzing his movements and posture, he came to the conclusion that the knight was at least level 4. The knight was most likely Mentis's henchman. The only thing that made Jack happy about this Iron Knight was that he knew his place. The butler was speechless at his master's next phrase. Jack replied that there was nothing wrong with addressing a dog as a dog. For a knight, it was too much. The Marquise's youngest son decided to clarify the relationship between them. The knight was assigned to him only to keep an eye on him. Jack was sure that Mentis had not given any other orders. Therefore, it is the knight who will bear the responsibility and all the dirty work after Jack. He will have to fix everything himself in the best possible way. The third Ballantier ordered the knight not to dare to speak a word about rights to him if he wanted to be promoted. The Iron Knight turned pale in horror. If Jack continued to act outrageously, he would be torn to pieces, to which the guy replied that the knight should beg him not to act up anymore. The knight only now began to understand that everything was not as simple as he thought. He had already come to terms with his situation and apologized to Jack. The young gentleman relaxed after these words, and the atmosphere stopped becoming tense. He was glad that the knight knew how to use his brain. But such arguments in the morning tired him out, and Jack decided to take his leave, putting an end to their discussion and ordering the knight to sort everything out and report to him. Jack also warned the knight that if the knight had any problems, he should complain directly to Jack's father, the Marquis. Deciding to reinforce the lesson, the nobleman decided not to address the knight as a knight, but called him a chicken, and so that he would chirp when Jack called him to him. The knight, now nicknamed the Chicken, remained in place to digest everything that had just happened to him. He did not like it. Such conversations awakened a great hunger in the nobleman, and he asked Ron to cook him some kind of meat dish. The butler obeyed his master's word and retired to the kitchen to prepare dinner for Jack, accompanying him to the gates of his estate. The table filled with various delicacies from Ron filled Jack's mouth with saliva, and he began to devour the steak with gusto. Jack once again noted the culinary skills of his butler, thanking him for such a delicious and quick lunch. Jack could feel the butler's gaze boring into him and gave Ron permission to say what he wanted without having to glare at him. But the butler was afraid to say what was currently in his head. He hastened to look away from his master. Jack decided not to give up and cut up a tasty piece of meat to treat Ron, because there was plenty of food anyway, and the nobleman couldn't handle it himself. But Ron's position did not allow him to dine at the same table with the one he served. He was only a butler, and Jack was a nobleman. But the third Ballantier was not satisfied with this, and he simply ordered Ron to sit next to him and share the food, while actively patting the place opposite him. The boy asked the butler with interest how his sister is doing. to which he receives the answer that she is fine. The butler looks at the boy with a puzzled face, who seemed not to quite trust his words. While the boy chews another piece of his food with gusto, the butler sits uncertainly opposite him, his head bowed down. Cabbage soup was being cooked in a boiling cauldron, the aroma of which slowly filled the kitchen. A small child peered out from behind the door, his large eyes watching with delight as the servant prepared dinner. The boy with long light brown hair held a bitten apple in his hands, looking back discreetly. The boy smiles and holds his hand to his chin, reflecting the slight bewilderment of his character. With a slight concern on his face, the guy listened attentively to the boy. On the left is a girl with chestnut hair pulled back into a flowered bun in a white dress, and to her right is a smiling man in a brown suit. The boy says that his sister was very similar to his mother and had the same good qualities. The younger gentleman turns to the butler with curiosity. Jack, smiling, says that if this whole story were the plot of a novel, it would be unrealistic. The sound of a horse's hoofbeats instantly rushing somewhere in rainy and cloudy weather. Two unknown men in cloaks were riding quickly on horses. A man with long hair sits on a horse that has raised its front legs in fear. A man with long dark hair wearing an eye patch looking forward. A guy in a cloak, sitting on a horse, stretches out his right hand, around which lightning has formed. The boy, holding a cup of tea in his hands, could not believe that his servant had been a ninth circle magician the whole time, while he sat with his head down. The boy asks the butler if he knew about his mother's ability. The butler looks thoughtfully at the same point, his gaze seemingly directed downwards. The boy, slightly squinting his eyes, says that he can pretend that he doesn't know anything. The butler, sitting with his head down, demands to know what the boy wants from him. Silhouette of a girl with long hair, with a pink ribbon on her hands on a purple background. The protagonist explains that his sister was so kind that she was ready to die for others. The boy's hands loosely intertwined. The younger gentleman stated that he intended to visit the academy, and if everything went well, he would not return back. In a relaxed atmosphere, the boy and the butler were calmly discussing something at the table. The butler had a sad look on his face as he addressed the boy. The boy looked at the butler with displeasure on his face, his voice full of indignation. Leaning back in his chair, the boy calmly said something. The boy cried out something in displeasure, clearly not expecting anyone. One of the knights breaking into the boy's room reports that one of the guards was sent to the hospital. Afterwards, he states that he was unable to control the blade due to his own carelessness. The younger gentleman turned to the guard with a slight smile on his face, mocking his actions. The boy, as if mockingly, offers the fair-haired guy a treat, but he refuses. The fair-haired knight, slightly bowing his head, introduces his real name. The boy, looking at the knight with a smile, asks him for a real sword for fencing training. The knight says that it is not his responsibility. A boy's hand weakly holding a silver fork. The boy grins evilly, leaning back in his chair. Jack insistently offers the guy to beat the crap out of him. A boy's hand, with fingers positioned at different levels and slightly bent. The knight looks at his palm with concern and confusion. A palace with brickwork and decorative elements against a blue sky. The butler, closing his eyes, tells the boy that this guy is on the fourth circle. The butler, with an uncertain expression on his face, asks the boy if he is confident in his abilities. The knight, standing among the rows of swords, carefully examined each of them. The butler, frowning, suggests that the boy not bet on losing. The boy asks the servant with a smile if he can bet on it. The butler, clearly worried about the boy, anxiously asks if he is sure about going for it. The boy bristled, his young face reflecting all his worries and insecurities. The younger gentleman offers the servant that if the knight hits him at least once, he wins. The butler, placing both hands on his knees, listens to the boy. The guy, looking down, says in a submissive voice that he can simply order if he wants something. The boy can barely contain his laughter at what the butler heard. The boy's hand, holding a fork, reaches for something. Looking away and slightly embarrassed, the butler remarks that it is awkward to point a fork at another person. The younger gentleman, holding a fork in his hands, blinked in bewilderment. With his pupils sparkling and his fingers crossed, the boy seemed to begin to devour his servant with his gaze. When the butler says he doesn't mind requests, he starts to beam with happiness. While the knight bows before the younger lord, the latter listens to him calmly. The boy rests his hand on his chin and looks away, a hand lying on a table with its fingers slightly bent. The guy looks worried because of the bead of sweat running down his face. The younger gentleman suggests that the boy go to a deserted place where they can train. A boy with a sly look and a smirk on his face mocks, asking if he is afraid of losing. In response, the guy says with some confidence that he is not afraid of losing to the boy. The fair-haired boy, clearly unsure of himself, begins to sweat from excitement. The younger gentleman asks the butler if there is a deserted place nearby. The guy thoughtfully put his hand to his chin, immersed in his thoughts. While the boy looks around the basement in surprise, exercising his elbow, two guys stand and watch his reaction. The boy asks the servant if he exercises here. In response, the guy gives a negative answer, saying that his mother arranged this place for her children. The younger gentleman asks why he didn't know about this place, to which the servant replies that the boy had no reason to go there before. Many cunning arrows and swords, neatly folded in their places. The boy beams with happiness as he looks at the butler, who readily fulfills his wishes. The boy, crossing his arms over his chest, turns indignantly to the fair-haired guy, a boy's hand with an open palm. The boy stretches his hand forward, opening his palm, demanding the knight's sword. The boy hands the boy a wooden sword while standing in front of him. The boy, squinting his eyes, smiles slyly, thinking about something. The boy looks forward with a serious expression on his face, as if assessing the situation or thinking about something important. The boy suddenly begins to attack, rushing towards the guy. The boy, waving a wooden sword, tries to hit his opponent, but the boy manages to block the attack. The guy underestimates the guy's attacks, considering him a rookie. Underestimating the boy's attack, the boy finds himself in front of his sword. The younger gentleman creates a tense and dramatic scene, leaving his opponent in complete shock. The boy smiles and his expression looks a little sly. There are beads of sweat visible on the guy's face, which may indicate that he is tense. The butler, covering his mouth with his hand, is surprised, watching how the boy managed to get close to the guy's neck. The boy, horrified by the sharp attack of his opponent, throws the sword from his hand. The boy finds himself on the floor in front of his opponent's sword. The younger gentleman fights his opponent with a real sword, immersed in the atmosphere of knightly tournaments. The sword is at the guy's throat again, and at that moment time seems to freeze. The butler stands in profile, holding his hand to his chin as if deep in thought. The guy looks focused, his black-gloved hand raised to his lips. The younger gentleman, with a smile on his face, holding a sword over his shoulder, asks something to the fair-haired guy. The boy looks worried and tense as he answers the younger gentleman's question. Next, the boy asks the guy when he started training with mana. The younger gentleman's face literally sparkled from what the fair-haired boy said. Having a fourth circle of mana mastery at 23 years old only means that the knight started training quite late, which means that he clearly has talent. If he trained harder, he could have already reached the 7th, if not the 8th level, and could also have received the title of knight captain. Jack headed towards the assortment and armed himself with a real sword, thinking how ridiculous it was that a knight with such talent was trusted to look after a child. He turned to James, saying that he was starting to like him. The knight only warned the boy that he could get hurt with a real sword, and the boy laughed in response. Jack gave him advice that there is a difference between confidence and vanity. Does he really think that what happened was just an accident? James was starting to get angry at the boy's self-confidence, and the younger one let him start the next fight. The knight immediately rushed into battle. It is this trait that prevents him from developing, Jack thought in the attack. The swords touched, and the boy knocked the knight's weapon out of his hands, putting the iron sword to his throat, thereby ending the duel with victory. Jack smiled and reminded James that this was the second time he had died today. The knight immediately recoiled from the sword, and the boy, he was in extreme bewilderment at what had happened, how a man of such a young age, who had neither skill nor magic, showed such success. The boy simply explained his victory by saying that he simply changed the direction of his sword during the attack. Nothing supernatural. The knight was in despair. He had lost to a 14-year-old boy, and he said with incomprehension that he did not understand how he had done it. Jack told him that it was just a matter of advanced technology and nothing more, after which he offered to show him again. James didn't lose his head and agreed on the condition that this time he would also take a real sword, to which Jack reacted as calmly as possible. While he was choosing a sword for himself, Jack turned to the butler, rhetorically asking if he had won the bet. Of course, Ron understood this. The boy recalled his desire to protect his sister during his training, and hopefully asked Ron if he would fulfill it. The butler leaned over in an interesting pose and declared that he would lay down his own life to accomplish this task. Meanwhile, the knight was already ready to begin the next duel and told the boy that this time everything would be different. Taking a fighting stance, Jack armed himself with mana, concentrating its power on the sword, and offered the knight to use his as well. James did so and suggested that Jack start the fight, who in turn attacked immediately. The blades clashed in a fight, but this time Jack's strength again surpassed the knight's, and the tip of the boy's sword was approaching the blonde's face. Unable to withstand the confrontation, the knight dropped the weapon from his hands and fell to the floor, suffering another defeat. Lying on the ground, James exclaimed, and asked uncertainly if Jack really had a third circle. But if it was the first, then such power was impossible. Jack stood above the knight in his thoughts. He understood how offensive it was for him to lose the first round. But it was all very simple. Usually mana is distributed throughout the body to increase physical capabilities, but he concentrated it in one place, in the sword. Jack asked the blonde if he really wanted to become an official knight, to which he replied in confusion that he did not currently have such a status. So what would the third master order him to do in that case? Jack's only response was to say that hunting dogs were very loyal, after which he confidently offered the knight to become his loyal dog and serve under him, because such a life would be much more fun and better than the life of an ordinary knight. James turned the boy's words over in his head and looked pale, stunned by such a proposal. It was only after a few seconds that he spoke, asking what he would gain if he did agree. Jack was bluffing, because he was counting on the fact that his interlocutor would first ask what he would have to do in the event of an agreement, and he asked the knight directly. Without waiting for his answer, the heir explained that if James did become his dog, he would receive the strength and power he needed. During the entire conversation, the guy listened attentively to the boy, after which the knight also asked, dumbfounded, what his duties would be. Kill those who interfere with the master and protect him at the cost of your own life. Jack's answer horrified the butler and the knight. They knew perfectly well that the boy was not joking, and the knight, in turn, asked who he would have to kill. Jack only said that it was not at all difficult to guess, and the goal was obvious. The boy himself meant his stepbrother directly by the goal, remembering all his endless mockery of himself. He gave the knight a day to seriously consider his proposal and choose the right side for himself. Already in the mansion, Ron gave Jack a relaxing massage, asking him if the gentleman was too careless in his actions and whether James should be seriously trusted. Jack, sipping his drink, answered negatively and said that of course he understood that most likely the knight would report everything to the Marquis, and smiled. The butler told him that he shouldn't smile in such a situation because it would only benefit her. And if the Marquise finds out that Jack is leaving tomorrow, she is in a position to arrange something really bad for him. Perhaps he will even kill. Isn't the gentleman worried about this? Jack only answered Ron in a relaxed manner that the Marchioness had the right to do whatever she wanted. Nothing would work out anyway, and he himself was lost in his thoughts. Several days had passed since the incident, but his brother was still afraid of water. Jack was absolutely certain that the Marquise wanted him dead, but could not do it yet. And the Marquis also began to keep a very close eye on him, because he needed him to control his sister, in which case the Marquise would not be able to kill him. In response, Ron simply asked him if he was confident in his actions, since the Marquis was capable of giving the Marquis's approval for his murder. Jack reassured the butler that he was leaving for the academy anyway, and there was no point in killing him now. And now the Marquise is only able to wound him, there is no need to talk about murder. At one time, many tried to kill the master, such as Lady Harpy, Lord Orc, Lord Dragon, but none of them succeeded. Jack laughed right there on the massage spot, wondering if this woman would succeed after the desperate attempts of the others. Afterwards, Jack thanked Ron for the massage and got ready to leave, explaining that he needed to exercise more to get his muscles working. Before leaving, the boy told the butler that they could not kill him unless he decided to die. Ron didn't understand the boy at all, what he was thinking about at such an early age, like his own death. Jack just joked that it was better for him not to know about it and laughed, and the butler continued to look at him in confusion and cold sweat. Jack said that if he was interested in what would happen, he could follow him, which surprised Ron, and he asked if they weren't going to go to the academy together. The boy turned sharply to him and replied that Ron could not go with him. That was his order, and it would be best for him to follow Jack from afar. The butler resigned himself to the master's decision and was about to go about his business when suddenly Jack turned to him with another request. He asked if Ron could not let anyone in because he wanted to create a second circle. Ron was shocked by his statement and turned around to ask Jack if he really thought it was that easy. Jack looked at him questioningly and mockingly, and a second later smiled and said that for him personally, such a matter was easy. Meanwhile, the knight was rushing along the corridor and desperately thinking. No matter how much he thought, Jack's magical skills could not match the first circle. At least the third, that's for sure. He understood that the third gentleman was very talented, but his request to become his personal pet dog was just plain stupid. After all, he doesn't have much support, for example the support of the Counts of Mentis, and he also doesn't have any personal knights, he's alone. James froze in the middle of the corridor and kept remembering the gentleman's words, his offer and confident tone. These are two strange words for a child. Having thought about everything, the knight decided to tell the Marquis everything. About Jack's hidden talents for martial arts, about their conversation in the basement. This was his chance. He broke into a nasty smile, thinking that he would finally be able to please the Marquise and the Marquis. His thoughts came together as one. No matter how talented the third gentleman was, he would never be able to defeat the Marquises unless he was a monster. Meanwhile, Madame Elizabeth sat in the spacious hall and listened to the Marquise's words about how her commoner mother had left her a chance for a good life. That Elizabeth has nothing worthy except her appearance. The girl, sitting, calmly listened to the nastiness directed at her and remained silent, unable to answer, when suddenly the Marquise offered her a glass of wine in order to calm down. Elizabeth immediately refused, explaining that she could not drink in front of the Marquise. The woman drained her glass in one gulp and continued her speech insidiously. She informed the girl that it seemed that the eldest son of the Duke of Malin was interested in her, as was the middle son of the Duke of Osenbul. The Marquise immediately interrupted herself, clicked her tongue and corrected herself. The middle son would definitely not suit the girl. She will find her a much better match, but for now, the girl should take very good care of herself. The Marquise asked sharply if Elizabeth had caught her eye, to which the girl jumped up and quickly interrupted her question, declaring that there was no such person. The woman immediately said that this was fine with her, because if the girl had already had someone in mind, he would have to be quietly eliminated. The girl sat on pins and needles and was afraid of the woman, when suddenly the Marquise started talking about her brother. She knew about Jack's conversation with the knight because the blonde reported everything to her. She told Elizabeth about it, how her beloved brother tried to lure the knight to his side. The Marquise brought the girl up to date and informed her that the knight had long been on the side of the second gentleman. Elizabeth shrank from her words. Suddenly, the Marquise burst into loud, insidious laughter, saying that this boy really dreams of destroying them. What stupidity that is. The girl sat desperately on the chair in her thoughts. It was because of their parents that her brother had such thoughts. She needs to be careful, otherwise their hatred for Jack will become even more serious. The Marchioness calmed her laughter and immediately turned to the girl, saying that it was very nice that Elizabeth understood her, and she will continue to look for a suitable partner for her, so the girl can only follow her own path. Suddenly, the woman leaned over the girl, wrapping her arms around her neck, and threateningly warned that if Elizabeth started dating some man behind their back, she knows very well how this will turn out. The girl shook with fear and only managed to say that she understood everything, and the Marquise could not worry about it, after which the woman left the girl alone, warning that it was approaching lunchtime and she could go down. The whole family, with the exception of the youngest third gentleman, was already seated at the table full of food. Suddenly, the door swung open and Jack entered the dining room. He was inspired. The Marquis and Marchioness looked at him with displeasure. The boy said that he was still his father's third son. Couldn't there be room for him after all? They needed to have dinner together at least once. There are two main ways to manage mana. The first is to distribute mana throughout the body. This method helps improve the body's abilities, enhance your senses, intelligence, and strength. The second way is to materialize mana by creating a formula. Fireball, ice arrow, demonic fire, and other types of magic. Ron is a 9th circle wizard, a 4th circle knight. There are two reasons why people who use magic are divided into wizards and knights. I am a knight. This means he can use magic. Jack had been working out a few minutes before coming into the dining room. The butler looked at him with complete incomprehension in his eyes, and the boy only said 2 words to him. 2 months. Ron said it took him so long to create the 2nd circle. Jack understood everything, although the transition from the 1st to the 2nd circle usually takes 4 months. But Ron did it in 2, and he didn't go back in time like Jack, so he can imagine how much work it took. Jack praised Ron for the very fast result. Ron said it was strange to hear that from a man who had created a 2nd circle in 5 hours. Ron looked at the time and replied that it was 5:48 in the evening. Jack was surprised that it was so late. He realized that it was already dinner time and suggested that Ron cook a steak as usual. Jack thought that the others would be having dinner now too. The guy exclaimed that he had decided everything, to which Ron, trying to stop him, shouted after him for the young gentleman to wait, to which Jack said he would simply tell them he was leaving tomorrow. As the young gentleman devoured the freshly cooked chicken, he thought that he had not known about the sumptuous meal in the main hall. Jack's brother Palon and the Marquise sat at the table looking very excited and frightened. Jack was glad that he had eaten tasty food and was full. Jack's father asked him if he had come to say something, to which Jack asked his father if he thought there was another reason and whether he would come here just like that. The father thought that his son would be ashamed to appear here without an invitation, but this did not happen. The young gentleman asked him why he spoke so badly of him, since he only spoiled the atmosphere. The Marchioness asked Jack to come out and talk if he needed anything. Father asked him to speak if he had anything to say, and Jack blurted out that he was returning to the academy tomorrow because he could no longer bear to be in such a nightmarish environment. To which the father was only glad about his son's decision. Jack just grumbled that he didn't need permission, and the young gentleman sarcastically thanked his father for his consent. Jack asked his worried brother how he was. He asked him if he could not drink anything because of his fear of water, and said that he imagined him tormented by thirst. Jack said that even though he had treated him badly all his life, a brother was a brother. The guy assured him that it was not water, but wine, and offered his brother a glass. The Marquis shouted that he was a scoundrel and that he was not ashamed to make a scene here. To which Jack retorted that the mongrel was barking again and he had nothing more to say. The Marquis called him a vile scum. Jack grinned and replied that he would wait for their next steps. The frightened maids hear rumors that Jack is a walking worthless person and should have been fired a long time ago. It was also heard that how dare he talk like that, and it was all his sister's influence, while one of the girls said that she didn't think that the third gentleman was capable of such a thing, and her words were confirmed by another girl. There was some wine spilled on the table, and one of the maids decided it was best to clean it up before it got stuck. It was a sunny day outside and the night passed quietly. Of course, if you don't count the scolding from the angry sister who hit her brother on the back. The Marquis's third son is leaving for the academy, and it is unknown why the procession looks so modest. Sitting in the carriage, he is grateful that at least he can sit comfortably. Looking at the knight riding next to him, Jack thought that it was that idiot Rajon, the knight of the Sixth Circle, who was in charge of the procession. The guy also thinks that Rajon is afraid to even look in his direction. Surely the Marquis gave him special orders regarding Jack. The sister asked why she couldn't go with Jack, and in response she said that everything would be fine. She said that mother had probably thought of something and it would be better if she saw him off. Jack grinned and told his sister that everything was fine. He assured her that he definitely would not die. Continuing to see his sister out, Jack asked how much longer she was planning to go. The sister gave in and agreed to leave, and as she said goodbye, she wished him to be careful. Ron asked Jack if he would be okay, since the situation at home was not very good. Jack thought that Ron and his sister had the same expression on their faces, later replying that everything was fine and asking if he remembered their agreement. In response, Ron assured that he remembered everything, because it was the request of the younger Marquis. Jack asked to take good care of her and come back already because he couldn't leave her alone. And I thought that Ron would watch the procession from afar so that he could witness what might happen. It would be a gift, so to speak, for Ron, who had served Jack for so many years. The procession continued to move, and Jack decided to rest for a while. It was already night outside. Jack continued to sleep in the carriage, and the sixth knight, Rajon, was angrily spying on the sleeping Marquis, as if he had something in mind. Sleepy Jack, getting out of the carriage, was surprised that night had fallen, and did not understand why no one woke him up. The whole procession stopped, and people unloaded things from the carts for a rest stop to spend the night. An awkward silence fell between the blonde, stately knight and Jack. By calling the knight his chicken, Jack understood what decision he had made, to which the knight replied that it just happened that way. Jack laughed and said that nothing else could be expected from the chicken, and that his decision would have to be accepted. Then, Rajon came up with a crowd of other knights, and said that since Jack understood everything, there was no point in long speeches. Serious Jack told him to explain because he would listen. Rajon's eyes lit up wildly. He said that every night during the 4-day trip to the academy they would set up camp, and Jack didn't understand what was so special about this information. Continuing his speech, Rajon said that in the meantime they would break Jack's ribs, and when it was time to go on their way, they would cure him with a potion. Rajon said there was also a separate order from the Marquis, and the knight said that the Marquis knew that Jack could make a mana circle, so his crowd of knights with him at the head is going to destroy him. The destruction of the heart's mana circle is like death, and although it can be restored, the chance of being filled with mana again is 1 in a million. Besides, shock can leave a person disabled for life, Jack thought. Rajon continued his speech, saying that James told them everything, that Jack was not only good at mana management, but also wielded a sword. Others may be mistaken, but the knight knows that Jack is nothing. He continued that it was impossible to change anything with just mana and a sword, and demanded not to resist so that it wouldn't hurt more. Jack found the atmosphere familiar, as if he had returned to his homeland, and the guy sitting in the carriage was looking at the squabble, to which the other told him that he shouldn't get involved in fights between aristocrats and told him not to look in their direction. Rajon began to pull out his sword, and Jack thought that he had experience from his past life. Jack reflected that no matter how peacefully he had lived these past few days, the wounds in his soul still ached, and it would be more accurate to say that experiences from the past could not simply disappear, and called out to Ron. Then the blade of the sword was pointed at him, to which he said that he had spent 10 years in the mountains. Jack met a mentor there and learned a lot from her. But when he went down after her death, he learned that much had changed. Continuing his story, the boy said that the Ballantyre family and the entire country were destroyed, and then he thought that he didn't care who died or why. Rajon did not understand what the third gentleman was talking about. Drawing his sword, Jack asked the knight what had happened to his sister. He said that his sister was smart and talented, and he hoped that she would at least be lucky with her husband, since things didn't work out so well with her family. Jack continued that if she was okay, he would forgive them for everything they did and hoped that nothing would happen. The crowd of knights laughed at him. Rajon asked if the third gentleman had gone mad with fear, and also teased him to try to defeat them with a toy sword. To which Jack replied that revenge was much sweeter than he thought, so much so that it drove him crazy. At that moment, a magical blue smoke appeared, and the younger master told Rajon that he was right, that nothing could be achieved with mere talent and a sword. If Jack had already angered the Marquis and Marchioness, then one broken rib could have leveled it out. Jack said that great power and outstanding talent could turn everything upside down and whether they could break his mana circle. He raised his sword, which was full of blue magic, above his head and said that he would show them how fast the storm was. At that moment, the knights felt everything in their guts, when a strange circle was already enveloping them, and Rajon was seriously scared. If they don't kill Jack, they will die themselves. Jack rushed at the knights with all his might, using magic and a sword, and began to fight them off. Choosing a second gentleman with strong support from the outside was wise, and better than choosing Jack, who no one notices. Jack's eyes lit up with blue flames. A magical whirlpool of power appeared around him, and it was as if death itself was standing behind him. And at that moment, James felt that time was stopping. A frightened Ron appeared in the bushes and asked the master what it was. There were dead knights lying around Jack. He thought it was a fencing technique he learned in the transcendental state, one of the 8 divided into characteristics by 4. But he replied that he could tell, but Ron still wouldn't understand anything. Ron said that he couldn't know everything about the master, but it looked more like a method of controlling magic than a technique, to which Jack asked if he had at least one potion. Here, blood started coming out of his mouth, and he was hitting himself with his fist in pain, and Ron was only calling him out of panic. Coughing up blood, the boy says that it's nothing and asks for the potion to be given quickly. The butler rustled in his pocket, pulled out a bottle with scarlet contents, and the gentleman, sliding down the carriage to the ground, drank it in one gulp. The cough still escapes from Jack's throat, which makes Ron worry because if he didn't have the potion, he would already be dead. But that's nonsense. He won't die that easily. And besides, he knows that Ron always has a potion with him just in case. And besides, Ron would like to give it to his master first and not to himself, because in the past he did exactly the same thing and personally poured the potion into the baby's mouth. Smiling, Jack says that in his haste he failed to tell his butler something. After waiting for a second of silence and looking at Ron with all sincerity, he said the most sincere thank you in his life. He was a fool in the past and these words seemed difficult to him. His hand weakened and, falling to the ground next to the body, the potion began to spill. Not knowing how to formulate it, Ron says that the master knows the future, and this is exactly what he has been hiding from him. Jack corrects that he went back in time, but the essence remains roughly the same. He felt better very quickly. It must have been a very expensive potion, but at the butler's warning, he decides to test it. Rising abruptly, he approaches the astonished servant and, picking up his sword from the ground, concludes that everything is fine. The white top lies in a pool of its own blood, and after a furtive glance, Jack tells the butler that the chicken is dead. He put his foot on his head and shook it from side to side. It was a shame that it happened that way, because Jack thought he could raise something good out of him. As a knight, he made the right choice, and that's why he's a chicken. You shouldn't expect anything from him. The strange thing is that the butler wasn't surprised when Jack said about going back in time. Wasn't he curious about the future of his sister and the Marquis? Regarding the latter, Ron thinks that the Marquis family will be destroyed, and judging by Jack's indifferent face and his reaction, the butler concluded that it would be terrible. To be honest, the guy would like to pretend that nothing happened. But if the butler is really interested, he can ask. With an intriguing smile, Jack asks him if he wants to ask a question but is refused. This seems very boring to the guy, and even if in his soul he is a grown man, he still behaves like a child. But isn't he even interested in his own future? Asks Jack, and receives a more vivid reaction from his butler. In the end, Jack doesn't get a very enthusiastic answer, and Ron also thinks that killing him isn't that easy. This will likely disappoint the butler, but Jack is as confident as he can be that he was easy to kill. It was upsetting news. Ron turned into a sad puppy and felt depressed. After all this, Jack decides to take a rest and, having warned the butler, climbed into the carriage and fell onto the seat. Bending over one of the slain knights with bitterness, Ron reached out and closed his eyes. In one attack, Jack killed 25 people, although it is difficult to call it just an attack. How is it even possible that he destroyed their hearts without touching them with his sword? Looking at the carriage where the gentleman was resting, Ron had only one question. Going back in time, what was his life like then? He worries and continues to look worriedly, as if he sees the boy through the wall, hoping that everything will be okay with him. A piercing scream wakes the boy from his sleep, and he comes to consciousness rather lost, which casts doubt on whether the potion helped. Confusion made Jack himself doubt whether everything was okay with him. Pain could even make him lose consciousness. The butler was holding an incomprehensible bag in his hands, and when he opened it, he showed off the contents. These were the knight's belongings, or more precisely, 5 elixirs, 63 gold pieces, and 40 shillings. It's amazing that the Mentis boys carry so much money around with them, Jack said with an awkward smile. Out of concern, Ron again decided to offer the guy to drink the elixir, but he refused because there was no point in it. But the guy extended his hand, which contained 3 potions, and gave it to the butler, supposedly in exchange for that one potion. Of course, Ron thanked him, but they weren't created by alchemy to exchange one top-class potion for 3 average ones. They also decided to leave the corpses here. They will be eaten by wild animals, or someone else will remove them. Everyone will start to suspect that Jack has powers unless he is here. At first, the boy didn't understand who cared about this, but the butler reminded him that the Marquise would do it for everyone. But for Jack, it was a trifle that the Marquis would do something with it, so he opened his suitcase and put in the bag containing the knight's money. Ron assumed that in place of the Marquis, he immediately called the third one to him. The boy proposes a bet, but the butler immediately refuses because he doesn't want to lose anymore, which shows that he is smart. To the guy's surprise, Ron gets down on one knee in front of him and says that he believes he has his reasons for thinking that way. A satisfied grin appeared on the guy's face. He asked, "No one knows that the butler is with him. Using an illusion, everyone thinks he's there, and most likely the second Ron is cleaning the yard right now. Illusion is a magic available to the 9th circle. It can be considered that few people have such an ability. Usually those who know how to use it, or at least recognize it, work in the demonic forest. But nothing can be completely certain. Perhaps when everyone finds out, the Marquis will interrogate Ron about what happened. If the butler senses danger, Jack asks to say that he is to blame for everything, and if he senses a threat to his life, then to pass on the words. The words that if Ron or Elizabeth's sister died, then on that same day the entire Marcus family would be destroyed. After this, everyone clearly felt uneasy. They froze for a while and silence hung between them. Jack helped to lighten the mood by saying that this phrase was only for emergencies. John hopes that everything will be fine. He will give the Marquis one last chance to behave like a real father to his sister. Ron is worried about whether the master really needs to go to the academy, and what will happen if the Marquis calls him. He is reassured by Jack's words that the academy has its own rules, namely that from the beginning of the semester, unless it is the death of a relative, then you cannot leave. It is clear from the butler's face that he wants to go with the master. He himself would be glad to do so, but it is too early. The butler is about to leave, and Jack wishes him farewell not to run into any monsters on the way back. Most likely, they will see each other again only in 4 years. But who knows? You never know what will happen. The only thing that matters most to Jack is his sister, and he asks Ron to look after her. Ron left, and now the only thing left to do is plan the route to the academy. From the Marquis' estate to the academy, you can camp on the mountain 3 times. But if you go by road, it will take 4 days, although by mountain it will also take about that. It cannot be said that the mountain path is more difficult. It is not particularly different from a regular road. Taking his suitcase, Jack goes up. There should be a village nearby. Approaching the horse, he tries to climb on it. But from the outside, it looks ridiculous. He doesn't succeed. It turned out to be quite a challenge. Because of my small stature, there were so many problems. It's just Jack and the horse, which makes this night seem so peaceful after what happened. But the boy has his own plans. He is not going to head to the academy right away. He feels very ashamed in front of Ron and his sister, but for now he needs to focus on his mentor. Valentine Milos brought him back to life, gave him the power to carry out his revenge, and made him, who everyone considered a nobody, a man. Even though it has been forgotten now, she is one of the most powerful black magicians. For those who remember, it is the most terrible memory. Jack's heart has not fluttered so much in a long time. Our hero arrived in Arbeloa, the province of the Viscount of Arbeloa, vassal of the Duke of Osenbla. Jack, looking at the children nearby, wondered whether it was worth staying there for the night. He felt good. He was smiling, Judging by the children's faces, this was a good place. Opening the door, Jack found himself in some tavern where people were having fun. He stroked the dog and decided to sit down at the table, hoping that there was no one to quarrel with here. The interesting waitress immediately noticed the new guest and had already managed to inquire whether he had come for a bite to eat or to stay the night. He was confused by her appearance. From the outside, she looked more like a mercenary than a tavern worker. Jack, holding out the coins, asked for simple food, water, a room for one night, and asked to bring the sword that was near his horse. But 1 shilling was enough. The inspired girl would bring him the famous Arbeloa apple pie and steak. And it would seem that this is enough. But she asks about the drink, whether he prefers milk or should she bring beer. Not bad. He could stay and live here even though he wasn't a local. She didn't try to squeeze more out of him. It's understandable, after all, it's pre-war time. Everything is cheap and everyone is honest. While petting the dog, he says that it has no idea what awaits it. Unwittingly, Jack overhears a conversation at the next table. They say that this time they are trying to get rid of all the demonic monsters, recruiting more magicians to deal with them all at once. But why do they need this, when even Tolkien is not doing anything, and there are only 20,000 mana users? The company discusses how they all seem to be laughing at them, and Jack listens attentively. Jack already mentioned the Ironblood Knights who are on a mission in the Demon Forest. By order of the Emperor, knights were selected from the guard of each noble family. These knights went hunting in the demonic forest with the Iron Blood Squad. This vast forest stretches across a mountain range called the Grand Canyon. This neutral zone may seem ordinary to many, but it is home to ogres, orcs, goblins, elves, harpies, and even dragons. Troll blood is used to make potions. Ogre sinew is used as bowstrings, and iron monsters, parrots, are used as material for weapons and armor. Harpy feathers are used for ladies' jewelry, and elves are kept as pets for their appearance. In the demonic forest, these creatures do not pose a danger, so everything that happens there is an excess of human greed. Jack tries to rack his brain to remember what happened there, and it seems like they're losing this time. During the massacre in the forest, the detachment of the Iron Blood Knights lost most of their troops. Knights and guards of the aristocratic families were also killed. The fiasco of the people that day was simply colossal. The losses they suffered led to the annulment of the support of the people and noble families towards the emperor. According to Jack's memory, problems in the imperial family began around that time, and a civil war would break out in about a year. The third gentleman's thoughts were interrupted by another drunk in the tavern, who angrily slammed his mug on the table and blamed all the problems on the emperor. He wanted to add something else to his speech, but his friends quickly shut him up in order to save their friend's head. One of his friends quickly cleared the air and with a nervous laugh noted how drunk his friend was. So much so that he was talking such nonsense. It was funny to watch such an act of fearlessness, akin to madness. Everyone knew that for insulting the emperor and his family, one could easily lose one's head. But in one of the drunks' conversations, Jack heard that they began to talk about the third son of the Marquis, Jack, and was immediately interested in such a change of topic. One of the drinkers asked his friend to explain what the third gentleman had done that was so interesting, and his drinking buddy replied that there were rumors about the use of black magic. Well, of course, none of his friends believed what he was saying. Everyone knew that Jack Ballantyre was a real fool, and besides, he had recently been imprisoned. Jack was nervous about this situation because he was here now. It was unclear from whom the third gentleman could have learned black magic, because according to historical treatises, all black magic had long since died out. One of the drunks suggested that perhaps one aristocrat retained knowledge of the dark arts, and he taught Jack his wisdom. A girl approached Ballantyre. The dog next to him looked curiously at the tray of food in her hands. She asked what could have made the boy so happy. Jack thought to himself about the word amused. Most likely during this conversation he also laughed along with the drunks, but he himself did not notice it. A girl sat down at his table and, laughing and in a good mood, asked him to tell her about Jack's humorous thought that made him laugh, because everyone here was incredibly bored. The girl in front of him was of amazing beauty with scars on her left cheek, white hair, and excellent figure. The boy replied that he was amused by the worthlessness of the Marquis's third son, judging by what was said about him. This is what made him laugh. But the stranger replied that, in essence, all people were like that. They loved to gossip about things that they themselves could never hear or see. He asked what the girl did at such moments as the stranger judged people. The girl thought for a moment and after a few seconds answered. In her opinion, if you wanted to know the truth, you had to see everything in person to decide for yourself that the rumors were just rumors and separate the truth from the lies. The guy noted with a smile that sometimes rumors really do turn out to be true, although rarely, but nevertheless it is so. The stranger stroked the dog and asked again in surprise. Jack cut off a piece of the pie that she brought him and noted that the pie, although not as exquisite as Ron's pie, tasted good. And to Jack's surprise, the stranger continued, she replied that she still thought that if it turned out that the third gentleman would be a good man, then all the rumors about him would be a lie. Jack froze in place with a piece of pie in his hands and a bitten-off piece in his mouth. He froze and did not know what to answer to this. The thoughts of this stranger were amazing. The girl asked what happened to Jack. He did not stop thinking. If you analyze her appearance, she was a person with scars, a pumped-up body, and surrounded by mercenaries. The stranger took the pie again and this time cut it completely into many pieces to make it easier to eat. Jack only quietly said whether she was the leader of the Adventurers Guild. At first, the mercenary was surprised, but then she smiled. Of course, Jack didn't say this just like that. Her presence here in itself was suspicious. In the village he arrived to, there was a huge number of mercenaries who were looking for easy money to fill their pockets with gold. Mercenaries did not shy away from any kind of work. They could join the local guard, be detectives in order to find someone, or become monster hunters. All such tasks were given out in the Adventurers Guild building, which was located in any province. This was a common area. That's why such guilds offer housing. Jack said that most likely the mercenary had a lot of free time. The busy guild leader would certainly not have served the tavern if he had a job, given this factor. Many questions arose. It was even a pity for the stranger. She replied that the building next door belonged to the guild, but now there was almost no work there, and what there was paid poorly, and living on that money was unbearable. That is why she paid great attention to the tavern as her only source of income today, because everyone wanted to live on something. Jack had correctly noticed that the place he was currently in was a cover for the Adventurers Guild. He had figured it out almost as soon as he entered. The guy noticed that the stranger was wrong to assume all this and think about him. Jack was known as the disgrace of the Marcus family, a complete mediocrity and a talentless young man. His story was a completely simple legend for the amusement of mercenaries in such establishments. But one thing did not leave my head, how the girl was able to recognize him, or whether she saw through Jack by his appearance. However, everything was much simpler if you think about it. A few minutes ago, when he rode into the city on his horse, he gave a distinctive sign. He was incredibly tired while riding his horse to this place. His journey was long and difficult, and all he dreamed of was a soft feather bed and a hearty piece of steak with an intoxicating aroma. As he entered the gate, some of the guards stopped him and asked him about the reason for his arrival. A lonely boy on a horse at night was suspicious, and to avoid further questions, Jack took out the distinctive sign of his house, the coat of arms of the Marquis of Balantier. The guards knew what he looked like and immediately began to bow and ask for forgiveness and apologize for not recognizing the third gentleman. After apologizing, they naturally allowed Jack to enter the village and wished him a good journey. He thanked them with cold politeness. That's how she found out everything out loud. He said that she found out from the talkative guards. But no matter how important the information was, one could not trust unverified sources. It was dangerous. The mercenary herself had just told him about it. She smiled with all her 32 teeth in kindness and answered that the third son of the Marquis was really worried about her. He replied with a grin that, for now, he thought to himself that this would last as long as she treated him normally. Despite all the rumors about him, her attitude towards Jack was better than the attitude of her own brother and her own knights towards Balantier. She was flattered by his concern and extended her hand in greeting, apologizing for him to introduce himself immediately. Her name was Jane Arbeloa. She was the master of the Arabs Guild in Arbeloa. She was glad to meet him, but the word Arbeloa was the name of a village, and she had a surname that sounded similar to that name. Jack remembered something. He asked her point blank whether she was the first or the second. Jane replied that she was the third. Her older brother was the local lord. It was quite unusual that aristocrats were engaged in such things. Usually they loved lavish celebrations and feasts. He became interested. According to Jane's status, she should have been married off because she was an aristocrat. The mercenary replied that she herself would not be against it, but there were complications. Her family would never sell her to someone else. They treasured her very much and were a strong, loving family for whom the words daughter and sister were not an empty phrase. Jack even felt a bit envious because he didn't have such a family. He noted out loud that her family was very interesting and unusual for aristocrats. Jane called her dog Arnold to her, and together they became entwined in petting and caressing, the dog lovingly licking his owner, who couldn't stop smiling. She picked up her dog and placed it on her lap, asking Jack what such a distinguished gentleman as the Marquis' son had forgotten in their small village, especially alone without a guard. The guy replied with a grin that the disgrace of his house did not need guards. His life had absolutely no weight or value, Jane and Arnold froze. The mercenary replied that Jack's behavior was very strange and his abilities did not correspond to the rumors that were told about him. Ballantyre ignored this and said that it would be difficult to reach his goal alone, so he would not mind finding an escort. Jane asked curiously what exactly he was looking for. He was looking for 5 people with experience in camping and good cooks. As for payment, Ballantyre was never stingy, paying 2 gold coins as an advance payment and 3 when they reached their goal. Such unthinkable generosity was incredibly rare in Jane's memory and was the first time she had seen it. Her eyes lit up with a possible opportunity to earn some extra money. Her surprise was explained by the fact that usually only 30 shillings per person were paid for an escort. But imperial money was very simple. According to them, 100 pennies was 1 shilling, and 100 shillings were 1 gold piece. Such money was large. Jack thanked her for the food. Arbeloa replied that by morning all her preparations, as well as those of her team members, would be ready for departure. She specified that Jack would pay separately for food and lodging. Ballantyre was not going to be stingy and replied that he would give them 3 gold pieces, and if they had horses and a carriage, this fact would greatly please the third gentleman. Jane liked the fact that they would help such a rich guest. It was necessary to use every opportunity to get rich. The mercenary replied with a smile that Jack had no reason to worry. There were people with a wealth of experience in the village, and gave Ballantyre the key to her chambers. Jack noted with a smile to himself that if such a woman was a guildmaster, then there was no need to worry about the well-being of the village. Arriving at the room, Jack collapsed exhausted onto the bed. The journey had left the third gentleman incredibly tired, and he only wanted to sleep. He dreamed of himself, memories from life. He found himself in a damp cave. Every now and then he could hear drops breaking on the stone. He did not stop sobbing and crying, but suddenly a figure illuminated by the moonlight began to talk to him. It took pity on this unfortunate child, saying this in a sweet voice. A hand with chains reached out to him. Did he really plan to live his whole life in helplessness and weakness? Did he want this for himself? The boy looked at the outstretched hand. Jack began to cry again. Falling to his knees, the figure continued. Being good was not something bad, but being weak in our world was a sin. Didn't the boy really want to change to finally feel the freedom and power of his life? The woman's words sweetly reached Jack's entire gut. The figure in front of him was chained by the neck and hands. The woman had green hair, but her eyes were not visible. The third gentleman said that he really wanted to change. The figure was pleased with his answer and said that from today onwards, the third gentleman should call her his mentor, and their path began. Jack's eyes opened. The guy woke up in a cold sweat. He himself did not notice how he was crying. Memories from the past always caused a storm of emotions in Jack. Judging by the light seeping through the window, it was already dawn. It was morning, which meant the mission's deadline had arrived. Today, Jane had to gather the people, and they would set out on their journey. But Jack's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp slam of the door. Jane burst into the room so actively and energetically that Jack was speechless. She replied that all preparations were complete, although she could have knocked. Following his mistress, Arnold burst into the room, who instantly jumped right on the third gentleman and began to lick his face. The sensations were not pleasant. How annoying that all this happened to him in the morning. Jack gathered all his things and went down the stairs, the drowsy haze still lingering on his face. Jane turned to him and smiled, seeing that the gentleman was sleeping soundly. The head of the guild assured Jack that she had prepared an excellent carriage for him. Jack would certainly like it, and he would not regret investing so much money in their trip. She also did not forget about Jack's request to assemble a team with extensive experience in escorting. When she went out and saw the group, 5 eyes were looking at him, their bodies covered in scars. Among them were those figures who yesterday were talking all sorts of nonsense about Jack in the tavern. Everyone greeted him, and with a white face looked away, greeting the young gentleman. The largest and tallest of the group stepped forward and introduced himself as John Doe, captain of the fire ant squad who would accompany Jack to the Stone Mountain. The figure extended his hand. Jack asked the stranger's name again, for John Doe was the name given to unidentified corpses, and this pseudonym aroused the curiosity of the third gentleman. Of course, Jack noted the interesting name of the man out loud, and he responded with warm courtesy, thanking him for appreciating such an unusual name. John explained that it was a long way from here to the Stone Mountain, and they would pass several small villages along the way, so their plan was to set up camp twice in hidden places. There were also 2 excellent cooks in the team. The mercenaries themselves were excellent at settling into camp. The guy sleepily said that he didn't have to do anything. And John, smiling, confirmed that this was indeed the case. They would take on all the work on this trip, let him not worry and enjoy the journey. The third gentleman was very pleased with this prospect, and he hurried his subordinates so that they would go quickly. Because he was already tired, Jack handed over the luggage and followed into the carriage. Finally, Ballantyre looked at Jane. She remained at the door, seeing off her guest. He noted that the guys were experienced, to which she showed an okay gesture with her fingers and said that the men were experienced. In principle, for his case, the ordinary mercenaries that Jane had assembled for him would have been enough, but Ballantyre was not so easy to deceive. Even though his body was now much weaker than before, his senses and eyes retained their ability to see hidden things. Despite the fact that Ron had the ninth circle, he tried his best to hide his enormous and real powers. It was difficult to call him an ordinary person. But that squad leader, John, was a mercenary with the eighth circle, and it was not a fact that this was his full potential. Such a prospect caused a little concern. But Jane replied that she only wanted to please her guest. Hadn't he said yesterday that he wanted the best of the best for his purpose, which she had selected for him? The guy answered with a smile that this was indeed the case, and that he and Jane would most likely see each other again in the future, so she shouldn't forget him. If this was indeed the case, Jane would have liked to have a beer with her guest to celebrate the event and Jack's departure. The third gentleman replied that he would not mind, only if it was at her expense, smiled slyly, and walked forward. The girl kindly wishes the little guest a good trip. A guy with his eyes closed rides on the roof of a carriage, enjoying the sunny weather. Opening his eyes, he notes to himself that he feels better compared to yesterday. Abruptly sitting up, he asks the carriage attendant if he heard who he was. The man admits that he knows the guy is an aristocrat, and that's all. The master told the man that the young aristocrat was traveling the world. The guy, thinking about his words, shows a desire to ask a question. Taking a wristwatch out of his inside pocket, he tosses it to the man walking next to him. He asks whether the coat of arms depicted on the watch with gold trim is the coat of arms of aristocrats. The man answers positively. The guy asks to tell him in more detail. Somewhere far away is the estate of the Marquis de Ballantyre. The guy smiles and says that their house, the Dam House, will soon be destroyed. The coat of arms depicted on the clock, theirs. This coat of arms belongs specifically to the Marquises of Ballantyre. The guy admits to their imminent destruction quite calmly and joyfully. This takes the men by surprise. The guy says that he heard that there is one complete loser in this family. He asks the man about it, assuming that he knows better. He even recently ended up in prison. The man begins to get very nervous and tremble. Finally, they understood who this guy was because it couldn't be explained more clearly. There were rumors that he was imprisoned for using black magic. The guy admits that these rumors are true. He knows a little about black magic. It's not difficult, because his mentor is one of the best black magicians in the world. Even though he is a swordsman, it is impossible not to know about black magic. However, why would he use magic when he has his fists? He points his finger at one of the tanned guys with a scar on his face, and he gets very scared. The Marquise's son asks why the boy stood there while he was saying such things about him, since he knows what will happen if he speaks evil of aristocrats. The guy asks if the escort doesn't feel sorry for him. Everyone present is completely confused. Everyone was at a loss except for one older man, John Doe. Surely it was the captain who was told about him by the guildmaster, and everyone else is not aware of it. The young aristocrat puts his hand on the frightened guy's shoulder and says that it's in the past. They'll only have a few days to spend together. The frightened boy answers him with difficulty, agreeing with his words. Around the fire, one of the guards says that he is convinced that the rumors are just rumors. He explains that the young man does not look like a typical representative of the aristocracy. Usually they are afraid that an extra drop of water will fall on them and ruin something. But he is not like that. He even washed the dishes himself. He mentally apologizes to Jane because this beef pie is much tastier than her apple pie. Yorkshire pudding, pie, and sausages. He wants to hire them to work in his kitchen. Having eaten a stomach full of delicious food, he sighs with pleasure. In his mind, he mentions that Ron is also a failure in terms of culinary skills. He admits that he is usually hard to please and that you have to pay for a good dinner. He asks who will stand guard tonight, and they tell him that they will draw lots. He is offered to join, but the disgruntled aristocrat replies that children need a lot of sleep to grow well. The confused male security guard retracts the invitation upon hearing this. The guys decide that things are getting boring and decide to start telling stories. The young aristocrat decides to start first and thinks about what he would like to tell the people around the fire. He asks if they have ever wondered how many dragons live in our world. One of the boys wonders if the emperor founder destroyed all the dragons many centuries ago. This is what the Foundation myth tells us. In short, it says that the founding emperor was Julius Tesla, along with two companions. They united and destroyed all the dragons that inhabited the Western continent. And here Tesla built an empire on the blood and bones of dragons. Over time, the empire became smaller and smaller and could not be compared with the neighboring Tulkun Empire. This is the truth that everyone here knows. The most common version of this story: 2 dragon lords in the Black Sea, a small dragon in Tulkun Castle, 5 dragons in the Monster Forest, 8 polymorphs that he personally knows, for a total of at least 16 living dragons. They find it hard to believe. Usually dragons are only mentioned in myths and legends. No one has seen them in reality. The young aristocrat asks with a smile if the story is interesting. Dragons do not approach people. They are bound by an oath, because of which they cannot approach places that threaten their lives. John Doe, who had been silent all this time, clarifies that it turns out that the founding emperor did not kill the dragons. The guy, smiling slightly, explains that the emperor did not kill everyone. He found a way to negotiate with them. Although it would be more accurate to say that everything worked out thanks to his 2 comrades, whose names have long been lost. John asks the young aristocrat what those 16 dragons are doing now. He says that in fact their continent is not the only one in the whole world. In addition to the Western continent, there is an Eastern continent beyond the Black Sea. Little dragons have little to do, but dragon lords have one mission: to protect the border in the Black Sea. The border was created many hundreds of years ago and separated the Western continent from the Eastern one. All dragon lords must protect it. He himself is interested in what the world of dragons on the Eastern continent looks like. All the men suddenly burst into laughter. One of them gives the young man a friendly hug and admits that he tells stories very well. In fact, the young guy did not even hope that the guards would check him and his stories. He gets up and goes to wash and change clothes, heading towards his carriage. The guard agrees to accompany him, but the guy refuses, since he can wash himself. He plunges into the source with pleasure, alone, and with only one lamp. Those stupid mercenaries didn't take his story seriously, so be it. But was it worth laughing at like that? He wonders why he lets them laugh at him. The protagonist who is forced to hide his true powers. He washes his face and leans his head back on the rocks, relaxing in the water. Now he's really worried about John Doe because he might be a spy for the Tulkun Empire, a suspicious type, and his behavior raises even more questions. The whole situation is like one giant puzzle, the guy notes with a tired sigh. He asked to provide him with good mercenaries, but among them was the owner of the 8th Circle. 8 circles is a lot. The captain of the Iron Blood Squad has the same number. In other words, such a frame would have been torn off hand and foot. But he is simply the captain of some unfortunate and unknown detachment. However, right now he has more important things to do than this suspicious man, the guy admits to himself. He had already managed to recover a little thanks to the rest in the carriage and the elixir. Well, there shouldn't be any problems, the aristocrat concludes. He needs to go to his mentor in any case. But of course, if he turns out to be a spy for Tulkun, it's better not to take him with you further. Dressed in clean clothes, he approaches the mercenaries behind the fire with the ball in his hand. He reports that he had to hurry because an urgent matter arose. Pointing the tip of his sword at John, he states that he is the cause of his troubles. He directly asks how a person with the 8th Circle can work as a simple mercenary. The young aristocrat admits that he is going to a place that is very important to him, and he is not going to bring a man there who is hiding something. The others are surprised to learn that John Doe is the 8th Circle, which is unexpected news for them. John openly admits his 8th Circle while standing in front of the guy and asks what it affects. The young man says that he told them an interesting story, and now he would like to hear John's story. He asks to tell him who he is and what he is doing here, still holding the sword with the sharp end towards him. John asks what will happen if he refuses. The guy says that then he will die. The guy's gaze suddenly turns to one of the mercenaries, a young blonde guy, and asks if he is a spy for Tulkun. That woman, Jane, said that they would have a drink the next time they met, but maybe he should suspect her too, the guy asks. John's face contorts and he asks with irritation why he suddenly started talking about her. The young man asks if he doesn't wonder if he'll buy her a drink before he kills her. He says this with a calm and even joyful face, noting that the situation is becoming more interesting. In his thoughts, he notes that he has come this far, but he does not use magic. It is unknown whether this is on purpose or he has something in mind. But it is better for him. He says out loud that he has little control over himself, so there are 2 options: die or stay alive. He says with a smile that he gives him 1 minute to think and advises him to think carefully. The day before, John and Jane were discussing him, the man remarking that he was an interesting kid. Jane tells him that he is the 3rd son of the Ballantiers, and that his family almost abandoned him. John Doe said that Ballantier's 3rd son had asked for an escort, so Jane had better find out what was going on. Jane thought about it and said that maybe he could change their lives. because he was not what the rumors said about them. Jack Ballantyre asked the mercenary what to do now, kill him immediately or leave him alive. The young man demanded an answer right away, and the mercenary didn't like the aura around him. Jack felt like all his senses were screaming for danger, like a deer meeting a lion. He put his sword to the mercenary's chest and was ready to strike him, and the whole situation was becoming very strange. The mercenary was surprised that this kid understood that he was the owner of the 8th Circle, and thought that maybe Jane told him something. However, then he thought that no, she wouldn't. He believed her. She would only tell if she was tortured. The mercenary told the young man that he himself admitted that he was in the 8th Circle. So would he be able to kill John? The mercenary raised his eyebrow, which was cut to the point of blood, rubbed his scratched cheek, and wondered why there was so much bloodlust in this child's eyes. And at that moment, John Doe began to doubt whether the little boy standing before him was really a child. The companion behind him told him that since he was in the 8th Circle, he could try to wriggle out of it or tell the whole truth. But the captain didn't know what to tell him, because he had lived his whole life as a mercenary. And now, all the choices he had ever made in his life flashed before his eyes. Here the kid said that the time for thinking was up, and if the mercenary was not ready, he would have to kill him. The mercenary asked the boy if he could tell what was happening to Jane. He agreed, and then John Doe began his story from afar. His story was short, nothing special. It can be found not only in his fate. A love story between an aristocrat and a commoner, such as these, can be heard everywhere. When he was 19 years old and on his 7th circle, he met Jane. They fell in love with each other at first sight and have been inseparable ever since. Jack thought that this was why Jane had never married. Even if it is a relationship between a commoner and an aristocrat, he could become Tesla's support with his 8th circle. Everyone around was surprised when they heard John's story that he and Jane were in such a relationship, but something had to happen to them. Although, given her character, it is safe to say that her family is not interested in increasing power through marriage. Jack began to ask more about Jane, and John confirmed that she was the master of the Adventurers Guild in this small province. However, the young man did not believe that John was a simple mercenary, and he asked the mercenary if he really thought he would believe him, but John confirmed his words. Jack wondered if he could be trusted, since such a simple story was easy to make up. He asked if they remembered his story about the dragons and what the Tulkun Empire would do with the dragon. John said he had no idea where he could have gotten such information. Then Jack said that he thought the mercenary knew that masters were those who carried 10 circles of magic on their hearts. But even the masters don't know that there is something more in this world. Monsters that use souls instead of mana as power. They are called transcendents. In 2 years, the captain of the Empire's knights will become a master and will be called the strongest knight on the continent. He will help forgotten stories about transcendence become reality again. Jack laughed and said that he found it funny that the captain himself could never become one. He asked John if he liked this interesting story, and he asked him to continue. The captain will replace half of his blood and bones with dragon blood and become half human and half dragon. Jack smiled and said that the faces of the audience immediately showed what they were feeling. And John asked the young man how this story was connected with what was happening now. He replied that the Tulkun Empire only had one dragon for now, and even though they were practically immortal, you couldn't conduct many experiments with one dragon. Jack raised his finger and, after a meaningful pause, noted that this was why the Empire sent its minions to other countries. This is necessary in order to collect information and to find other dragons. The mercenary didn't believe it and said that it was just a story from a novel. You can't believe in such things. He suggested that Jack tell this tale to the other mercenaries, in case they took the bait. But the young man snorted contemptuously, and I thought to myself that it was difficult to tell from the mercenary's reaction that he was a spy. John asked the boy if his doubts were cleared up, and he nodded affirmatively, lowering his sword. And then he wished the mercenary good luck with the guildmaster and said that he was waiting for an invitation to the wedding. Suddenly he turned around and again pointed his sword at the mercenary, who had already managed to turn his back to him. Jack said that since he was the one who suspected him first, he would spare his life. He grabbed the mercenary by the collar and said threateningly that this was his last warning. And if John tries to do anything against him, Jack will turn everyone, including him, into dust. The companions became worried and suggested that they calm down, put down their swords, and talk. Jack thought that it seemed to him that he and his companions had already become closer, but apparently by doing so, he had only pushed them away from himself. But nothing could be done. The relationship between employees and employers is always like that. He asked John a question that had been bothering him for a long time, why he was working as a mercenary with his 8th circle, but he replied that he didn't know. Jack said that he also found it strange that the mercenary said that he had a fourth circle 2 years ago, and he confirmed that this was true. The captain's companion set aside that he was offended, of course, but he really was a good captain, and even saved his life, so he wouldn't be too offended. He smiled and told John that the 8th circle was great. It turned out that John was the best mercenary captain on the entire continent, and offered him to become the king of mercenaries. But John chuckled. He thought this title was stupid, and he asked since when one could become the king of mercenaries with the 8th circle. The companion said that, as far as he knew, there were as many as 4 masters among the mercenaries, but John replied that he did not think so. Jack was surprised and asked his companion if the words spoken by the mercenary were really true, and John confirmed it. The young man was surprised and said that this news was shocking for him, but he would try to survive it, and John replied that everyone has their own secrets. Jack smiled and asked the mercenary why he didn't do anything then. John replied that even now his hands still tremble and he feels like he was on the brink of death. The mercenary closed his eyes and thought that if he had gone just a little bit further, he would have shit himself from fear. He also decided that Jack was an interesting guy, albeit dangerous, and that he should try to get to know him better. The satellites noticed that the entire continent was on edge due to the fact that there was a struggle for the throne in the Tolkien Empire. And if spies and dragons appear in the current situation, it will probably be bad for everyone. Jack was already falling asleep, but he thought that this would really only make things worse, and he needed to find out more about it. A couple of days later, Jack asked his companions if he would like to tell an interesting story. He asked his listeners what they knew about the Orc Lord who lived in the magical forest, but they said that, in principle, nothing, and suggested that perhaps he had the 9th circle. Jack laughed and said that it was not the 9th, no, but, as he thought, probably the 10th circle of power. The young man noted that someday they would know for sure, but he still wanted to tell a story about the past. Jack said that if you count by imperial time, then that was 23 years ago. The youth quietly said that the Orc Lord was very fond of weapons, and asked his listeners if they knew about his relationship with the Harpy Lady. They replied that they didn't know, and their faces were tense, as if this story frightened them. Jack continued that it was difficult, because it was generally accepted that relations between orcs and harpies were not very good. And not even that not very, but, in fact, on the brink of war, because they were constantly in conflict with each other. The young man noted that he always thought that the mercenaries who were constantly hanging around in this forest for money should at least know something. Orcs and harpies are 2 races that are considered the strongest in the magical forest. They are even called the protectors of the forest. Jack said that there was one reason they were given such a nickname. They were very strong, and asked his fellow travelers if it was strange to hear that the Orc Lord and the Harpy Lady were in such a relationship. But he continued that, in general, initially they were not enemies, but simply neighbors. At that time, Blackman became the Lord of the Orcs. He began to increase his power and succeeded in it. Jack continued his story and said that not everything went smoothly, and after 5 years, problems began. Blackman and Lady Harpies were happy together, but then everyone found out about their relationship. In essence, all races, humans, harpies, orcs, strive for the same thing. Everyone wants power, strength, and is ready to do anything just to get it. Some harpies and orcs wanted to overthrow their rulers, and of course, the operation to overthrow had to be carried out secretly. But in the end, their stupid plan went to waste because everyone knows that Blackman and Lady Harpies still rule. John said that was true, but wondered why relations between the races had not improved yet. After the internal uprisings ended, Blackman and Velia decided that their people were more important than love. The mercenary wondered if everything the kid was saying was true, but said out loud that it was interesting, and one thing was for sure. Decades ago, harpies and orcs were not as dangerous as they are now. Jack replied that for some time now, these 2 races had begun to gain strength, and 10 years ago they were first called the strongest. The harpies were able to steal and copy the orcs' secret fighting techniques, and the orcs learned elementalism from the harpies. This is how the largest and most powerful races inhabiting the forest were able to master each other's secret techniques. And 2 rulers of the 2 strongest races, Blackman and Velia, were able to directly contribute to this. After this, the 2 races finally moved away from each other, but at the same time became the main ones in the magical forest. Jack suggested that his companions tell this story to the orcs or harpies if they encountered them. The young man laughed and added that then, perhaps, the representatives of these peoples would not kill them immediately. John thought he didn't know whether what he had just heard was true or not, but he would pretend to believe it, and said out loud that if that happened, he would probably do it. After a story that is hard to believe, the man offered Jack meat. The boy immediately agreed and began to happily devour it, since Jane had made it herself. In the Marca's office, they report that after the province of Arbeloa, all the guards accompanying the third gentleman were discovered. After conducting an investigation, they found out that most likely everyone was killed by high-level magic. This news made the Marquis tense. There is a possibility that it happened precisely when the Iron Blood Knights were absent. Not knowing that his youngest son has magic makes him think of the Emperor, the Duke, anyone but Jack. Not content with what his men have said, he decides he needs to conduct a personal investigation and tells Gonzalez that they must find the culprit. Finally, the Marquis remembers his younger brother and asks why he didn't mention him right away. Did he really manage to survive? He is informed that Jack was not found among the corpses, therefore they thought that he might have escaped. The Marquis sighed heavily and assumed that then the younger one, as a witness, must know something. The Marquis ordered to use all forces and find out everything. As Gonzalez walked away, a smile crossed the man's face. Perhaps he had understood everything, because he reminded himself that he thought the third was useless. But it turned out that was not so. The next day, Jack continued his journey. Now he was at the beginning of the mountain range. A hand holding a bag, which had previously been collected from the belongings of his murdered servants, reaches out to give it to the good man. The bag was strangely heavy. He looked inside and saw a lot of money. He was taken aback, because it was too much. But the boy reassured him that 10 gold coins and elixirs would be enough for him. The rest is their tip, because Jack had a lot of fun on the road, and at the same time he apologizes for suspecting him. Smiling innocently, the boy says goodbye to everyone present and wishes them to be careful on their way. But the men continue to stand silently and look at Jack, and eventually it is he who begins to speak, saying that he may be crossing the line, but he wants to say something. His voice becomes more serious. And the only thing he says is that being a mercenary isn't as bad as it seems. This did not help Jack. But the man continued that he did not know everything, but would only say what he was sure of. He begins to speak in hints that he is the third son of his father, rejected by everyone, and he does not want to brag. But he has seen the end of many people who were in the same position. As the man listed his status, which was known to all people in the area, his face became serious. Afterwards, Jack relaxed and, rubbing the back of his head, asked if he wanted him to become a mercenary too. The man, putting his hands on the boy's shoulders, simply repeats what he already said. It's not such a bad thing. Perhaps these words made him think. Jack's brows furrowed, and he looked at the speaker with suspicion. If you avoid dangerous tasks, you can see the whole world and earn good money. Where else do they give you such experience? Pointing to the man's comrades behind him, Jack says that maybe they didn't understand, but he himself should have figured it out by now. That night, if Jack had wanted it, the man would have been dead, and that makes him tense. He should know. Even if Jack is not an 8th circle mage, he should have felt the proximity of death. Closing his eyes, the man says that he knows, which is why he asks, because Jack himself does not yet realize the scale of the possibilities. Awkwardly scratching the back of his head, the man admits that he himself doesn't really care about it anymore. In a world where everything is decided by whose sword is sharper, many hide their true strengths and intentions. The man thinks that, overall, it was his fault, and Jack, thanking him for his words, still pretends that he didn't hear anything. Jack motions with his finger to the man to bend down and whispers in his ear that he will only tell him this because he seems special to him, and in a few years a great disaster will come to the Western continent. And as much as a worthy and strong mercenary would not want to admit it, Jack's advice is that it would be better for him to just hide. He wouldn't understand his words now, but Jack asked him to simply remember them, and the man smiled incredulously in response. Making a face that looks like he's about to start laughing, he says that this is going to be a serious mess. Therefore, you shouldn't sell yourself for a few gold pieces. Money is important, but not more important than life. The man smiles kindly and agrees, as if it's funny for him to receive moralizing from a child. Jack was satisfied with this answer. Tapping him on the shoulder, he said that he was free and began to leave. A call makes him turn around again. The man asks him to wait and asks the name of the unfamiliar boy. This was a surprise for the boy. He already knew who he was, so why tell him anything else? Still smiling, he says the name Jack, saying that a man can remember him that way. For the sake of politeness or perhaps genuine interest, the guy doesn't leave right away but asks the same question to the man. He tenses up but confidently pronounces Dinas, or rather, his name, Dinastismo. Jack was very amused by this acquaintance, and before leaving he suggests that they meet again sometime. Using mana, he easily crosses the mountainous terrain and eventually stops. It's very tiring for him. It's like training. He looks into the distance as if he's already close. His body is still too small and he cannot jump as far, which causes discomfort. Jack enters a strange, dark cave and lights his way by forming mana in his palm. It is precisely here, behind this wall, that his mentor is, and he touches the cold stone with his hand. In the past, he discovered this place by accident. In his head, there were only thoughts that he wanted to leave his family. It was too hard and too much pressure. He removed the cork from the bottle of blue liquid with his teeth and splashed it all onto that very wall. There's one thing left, and Jack touches the hilt of his sword to draw it. His childish fingers touch the sharp, thin blade. His whole appearance screams that this is an important moment in his life. Clenching his fist, the blade cuts him. Blood begins to flow and drip from his hands. But for him, it is a small sacrifice. The blade is pointed at the throat. Before his return at 17, everything was different. Although it was morally difficult, then he pointed the blade at himself. He simply hid and ran away. Having lost Ron, he had no choice but to end his own life. But the past Jack was too weak to do this, so he dropped his weapon and burst into tears. Blood and tears mixed. Flowing down the stone, stumbling upon a hidden entrance to a cave was a great fortune for someone like him. Now he acts consciously, and as in a past life, a door also opens before him. As if knowing this path by heart, the guy descends the steep white stairs to the very bottom. But still, it is not clear even to him why this is so, but in his heart an experience trembles. Although it should be obvious, decades have passed since then, and the chance to live life again does not always present itself. Having reached the end, he finally came to the place where he wanted to go initially. In front of him is a little girl in chains, as if she had not yet learned to speak, but dressed like an adult woman. This is his mentor. He hasn't seen her for a long time. Is it possible to make a living thing immortal at all? Everyone in this world wants to live as long as possible, no matter if you are a human or a magical creature. Orcs, dragons, emperors will all die one day. It is natural and right. For this little girl in chains too, but still his mentor is not simple like everyone else. Unlike others, she has lived for 400 years, which you can't tell from her appearance. This happens due to the separation of the soul from the body, and magic is what maintains the connection between them. The problem is that this process will soon come to an end. Nothing in this world lasts forever. In her past life, after meeting Jack, she lived only 10 years, but this time everything will be different. This time he came to her earlier. In this life, they will be allotted 13 years. Jack, like a small happy child, looks into her eyes. He has wanted to hear her voice for so long. The lady in chains, not yet acquainted with this man, asks who he is. Not afraid of such a majestic lady, he asks her to guess. But the mentor clearly doesn't like this one. In an angry voice, she says that she won't ask twice and orders him to answer. But the guy continues to coddle her, telling her how mean she used to be, which causes even more discontent. Jack presses his hand to his chest and sincerely tells her that he missed her very much, but she still doesn't understand. The mentor says that she doesn't know him at all, and it's strange. The guy even knows who she is. In response to the question, he nods smugly. How can he not know? And begins to remember. It is impossible to forget the time they spent together and how his mentor trained him. And it can't be called an illusion, but their entire life together flashed before his eyes. Clenching his fist, he continues to sit on one knee, of course. Only Jack remembers everything. Putting it to his chest, he says that she is the heroine of their world, who brought an end to the era of honor and began the era of humanity. Jack proudly declares that she is Valentine Milos, and he is her student from the future. Most likely assessing what is happening, she asks him again if he is from the future. After receiving a positive answer, she says, shouldn't he know that she doesn't like predictions? To which Jack agrees and says that this is because any prediction is subjective from the point of view of the one who makes it. She asks why he speaks like that then, as if his expression is incorrect. She asks him to answer her, if in this future she really will be in his life, what would be her answer in such a situation? This makes him rub the back of his head with agility, because all the mentor would tell him is to disappear. The woman agrees that he is not bad and tells Jack to open his fortune-telling booth. Everything is as before, she is exactly as he remembers her. Jack gets up and says that there is nothing to be done then. Drawing his sword once again, he now points its blade at the small body in chains. Jack apologized for having to go so far, and a blue glow formed around him. The guy took a confident stance with a sword in his hand. The woman notices that he is using aura. He says that he understands that he is behaving incorrectly, but the teacher will be able to punish him later. Enveloped in magical currents, Jack noticed the restraining chains that were everywhere here. In order to free the figure, they had to be destroyed. He made a decision that by destroying the chains, he would destroy this place as well. But such a prospect did not frighten the guy, and he decided to free his future mentor from captivity. Although he had no choice anyway, Young Balantier rushed forward with his blade at the ready. He was going to strengthen his blow with magic in order to destroy the shackles. Once upon a time, decades ago, Julius Tesla locked his girlfriend and comrade in this place, despite the fact that this man was called a hero and a man of honor in ancient times. Julius promised that he would return for her. He swore that he would not abandon her in this place, and the mentor believed his promise. The connection between them at that time was strong and trusting. But this traitor to the oath did not keep his vow and abandoned her in this cave. Day after day she waited for him and hoped that Julius had not forgotten her. But after 50 years all hope left her. She was abandoned. She finally resigned herself to her fate of spending her time in captivity until her death. She did not expect help or support from anyone, and only humbly awaited her fate. But Jack Balantier broke her gaze. The boy gave her hope, rushing forward. The nobleman swung his sword so that she did not have time to follow him. The teacher felt her strength and energy returning to her body. She couldn't believe it. These shackles were made of dragon bones and were considered indestructible. This guy hadn't even crossed the threshold of adulthood. But he already possessed a powerful force. She had never encountered anything like this before. Her weak, floating body was picked up by Jack. Holding his mentor in his arms, Jack assured her that he was not like Julius Teslin, and he would never do as he did. The small figure never taking her eyes off Jack. Balantier was going to prove to her that he was not like Julius, not just with words but with actions. He had a lot of work ahead of him to restore trust, but it was worth it. As he expected, the walls of the cave where the mentor was imprisoned were beginning to crumble. Jack needed to quickly leave this place. He asked his mentor to hold on to him tighter. He would use his skills and past knowledge to get out of here. Jack had come too far. Gripping the blade even tighter, he gathered all his remaining strength into himself. Jack spoke the words for the magical spell of protection that his mentor had taught him in his past life. The rockfall was about to end the lives of 2 people under its vault when the entire cave was illuminated by blue light and lightning emanating from Jack. The small figure on Jack's shoulders was surprised by such knowledge. The spell he used was one of the 4 basic defense techniques. The mountain of the 4 great elements that the nobleman used could save them. After finishing the technique, Jack thrust the blade into the rock and prepared to strike. An explosion of colossal magical power wiped everything within 100 meters into dust. A large crater gaped in place of the blade. The figure asked Jack who he was. Jack just chuckled and said that as he had already said, but her student, and she his mentor. The blade slowly disappeared into dust in Jack's hands until it turned into nothing. The teacher was puzzled as to how Jack could have such enormous power at such a young age. But Jack was her student, and for him such powers were just a demonstration of a fraction of the power that the teacher had endowed him with. For the next 13 years, Jack and his mentor would travel the world, during which time Jack's teacher would teach him various magical and fencing skills. The little figure could not believe such an amazing truth, and to make sure of its authenticity, she, as Jack always remembered, touched his face with her hands to count the truth. Although Jack wasn't sure that this technique was 100% effective, it was all he could do, and he humbly waited for his mentor to finish. She was still confused and asked if he was really from the future. Her question seemed funny to young Balantier. He would have to try hard to make her believe him. But the expression that he was from the future was not entirely true. Rather, he had returned from the past. His tone and body movements did not betray the lie in him, and the teacher decided that it was true. A weight was lifted from Jack's heart. She believed him. He could breathe out, but his body suddenly weakened, and Jack fell to the ground in a semi-conscious state. The mentor thought about everything that happened today. In her opinion, it was somehow strange to start a relationship with her future student with so much strength. But Jack's unconscious body heard her. He replied that otherwise she would not have believed Jack. She did not believe that they could really be friends. But the nobleman did not see anything wrong with the friendship between a student and a teacher. It was amazing how, despite the pain, he could still argue with her. And he did it quite competently and coherently. Jack's endurance also amazed her. But there was nothing surprising in this, for this was one of the knowledge that the mentor had given him. Balantier remembered that he had not even introduced himself. His name was Jack. The strength finally left her student when he noted that he hoped for good work together with the mentor. It was like that in his past life, and it would be wonderful if it remained like that in this one. 5 days later, he and the mentor arrived in the province of Osimbel. His teacher was alive, and it was worth rejoicing, but the whole situation was slightly tarnished by one fact. During these 5 days, the mentor did not say anything to him, did not want to talk to him. For 5 days, they walked and strolled together, but she still could not trust him. Jack came to the conclusion that the thoughts in her head did not give her the desire to communicate with him. Balantier even told her that since when did her words come at a price? Sitting on his shoulder, she said that the first shock for her was his origin from the Teslan Empire, the last time a native of there betrayed her. She also still couldn't understand how a youth at such a young age possessed such magic. And it was soul magic, rare and difficult to control. She wasn't stupid and knew what its owner had to go through to gain this power and learn to control it. But she wanted him to finish her sentence himself. He needed to tell the truth, even though she probably wouldn't like it. He wanted to keep quiet. But based on his past experience with the mentor, he remembered that in that case, she would just hit him. He started from afar. In this world, there are powers that only a few possessed. Especially the number of such was even smaller in the ranks of mortals, she agreed. But she saw that his soul contained thousands of dead people. She couldn't even imagine what kind of guy was in front of her now. You have to be a real monster to kill so many. Jack just grinned. Of course she was right, as always, and he would gladly like to tell and explain everything to the mentor, but she did not want to talk to him. Jack's hands were covered in blood up to the elbows, much more than her own. They went to the butcher's shop to buy supplies. The naked flesh reminded the mentor of past victims. Jack was interested to hear information from his previous teacher, but had Jack, with all his sins, with so many ruined souls, ever thought about one detail? Why was the chance for a new life, for correcting all the mistakes given to him, in a good way he was not worthy of such a prospect? Jack could not answer her. He himself had been thinking about this for a long time. The very fact of his return to the past did not lend itself to any reasonable laws. He did not solve this riddle. Jack only answered the mentor that he had come to no conclusion. She looked at him with a sad and contemptuous look. The busy street was bustling with life. The couple walked further along the road. The mentor's gaze made Jack feel uneasy. He tried to soften the situation by saying that it was not he who brought himself back to this world. Rather, someone had plans for him, for the fulfillment of which he was brought here. He reasoned that if someone had a goal, then this stranger himself would show up, and then Jack would be able to answer some questions, but if not, then he would continue to live on. The conclusions of her student led the mentor into some confusion. She still does not understand Jack, and by what rules this young man lives, he still hides many secrets. Jack continued. Anyway, at this point in time, the most important thing in Jack's life was her, the mentor, and the time spent with her. Balantier showered her with a gentle smile. The mentor transferred herself to the guy's arms. Her childish height allowed her to do something like that. She noted that Jack knew how to seduce people with sweet words, but she was more interested in the plan. The first thing she needed to do was find allies. Jack remembered his pirouettes in the cave, how he fought in the place where the mentor was imprisoned. It was hard for him. His body was still physically weak. The execution of the protection spell took not only all his strength, but also affected his health. He was on the verge of death. He was lucky. And yet, after being rescued, he had to drink 2 high-class elixirs to restore his health and normalize his condition. Although despite this, the pain haunted him for another 5 days. He was well aware of his chances for such adventures. Due to his weak body, he needed good protection. Otherwise, his journey would end before it had even begun. They went on shopping. They needed to stop by the blacksmith to buy a sword. The old one fell apart in his hands before Jack could get out onto the main road. As a blonde girl with a basket of yellow flowers flew into him, she was whining in pain, holding her forehead. Apologizing for such an incident, she said that she had urgent business. Jack apologized. He didn't look around. He reached out to the girl to help her up, when something about the lying peasant woman suddenly alerted him. He made a decision instantly, deciding to start assembling the team with her. The girl was shaking herself off and collecting fallen flowers all this time. She was glad that she remained safe and sound. Looking up at Jack, a bag of gold coins was hanging in the hands of a young man in front of her nose. Jack offered the stranger to work for him, or rather with him. At first, she didn't understand anything. But when she began to understand Jack's offer, her eyes widened in surprise. The guy said that in return he would give her this bag of gold. She took the bag and it turned out that it was indeed full of gold. The girl thanked him for the offer, but regretfully noted that she could not accept such money. The young man decided that she was from a poor family and asked her how much she wanted for the work. But the blonde didn't lose her head and said that 1 shilling would be enough. Jack was amused by the girl's confusion. He hastened to give her a shilling. She extended her hand to take the coin. The cold coin touched the girl's flesh. She immediately gave Jack her basket of flowers. Jack didn't know what to do with these yellow flowers, but thanked the girl for it. The mentor watched the blonde with interest. Having given the basket, the girl hurried to hide, but after running a little, she remembered that she had not bowed in gratitude. Jack sheepishly accepted the gratitude. and the blonde wished them a good day. Now, his team had its first comrade, who, however, was not just a person. The mentor noted that she had not seen vampires for a long time, who were rare guests on Earth. Not fully recovered from the meeting, Jack agreed that it was surprising. He also did not expect to meet a vampire, and in a crowded human city, the mentor rewarded him with a cold look. A moment later, the youth realized that he had indeed met a vampire. He had not known this until the mentor said so. She was surprised, thinking that he had chosen her because of her appearance. Balantier replied that he chose her because of her great potential. He thought that she would be able to reach the 10th circle, which is the achievement of a strong magician. The mentor was irritated by his reckless stupidity. It was surprising that such a person had ever acquired such power. But the youth only confirmed her suspicions and said that he hoped for her long life, during which the teacher would teach him a lot. But this would depend on Jack himself. He was pleased to notice that the mentor he knew had not changed at all, and the couple went on shopping, although the teacher was now talking to him. As they walked, the image of that girl stood before the mentor. She had definitely seen her face, those eyes and light curls somewhere before, but she couldn't remember where exactly. Pulling herself together and meditating a little, she remembered a happy couple in the forest. A boy and a girl dancing and laughing, circling each other. The appearance of one of the children of the forest in a human city was amazing. Lately, since her awakening and return to this world, she had been haunted by strange phenomena. And who knows what will happen next? The teacher knew where to buy a sword, and they went for the blade. Vampires were one of the most unusual and powerful races. Along with dragons, graceful and strong, drinking human blood, they were common in ancient times. Jack recalled the sad history of the development of their race. While the consultant told him the features of this or that sword, the girl did not notice how the youth was listening to her with half an ear. In ancient times, there was a war between vampires and dragons. There were a number of reasons accompanying this event, the main one of which was power over the demonic forest. After a long series of battles, the victory of the dragons became obvious, as a result of which many vampires had to leave the forest for unknown lands. Or rather, those few who survived fled. The girl they had met today was probably one of the runaways, or at least one of the children of the runaways, and Jack hated to think what she had gone through. But young Balantier was not interested in wars at the moment. His eyes fell on one of the swords. The consultant noted that it was an excellent choice. The steel was made by a special blacksmith from a rare material. All these thoughts about the past were getting on Jack's nerves, and this blacksmith's place with ancient armor from the past brought back old memories. He asked for this sword. Wherever you looked, there were cats everywhere in the armory. The girl herself was probably an avid fan of them. When buying the sword, the girl wished for good use of the blade. Now all doubts were dispelled. He warned the mentor that he had already decided for sure that she would become his comrade. The teacher was not too surprised by his decision. However, she did not understand why Jack needed all this. She asked him again if he was sure of his decision. The consequences could be very different, and the responsibility would be on Jack. The nobleman understood her fears, but he was only doing this for himself. The couple were already heading to the market where they had last seen the vampire. Jack knew she would be there. The blonde herself needed such a chance to get in. Their journey together would help her to open up to the fullest and fulfill everything she wanted. As Jack thought, she stood in front of the meat counter and animatedly talked about something. But the mentor was not so sure of Jack's purely caring intentions. Was he really giving her a chance not solely for the sake of his own plan? The couple approached the blonde. Jack greeted her warmly. Jack immediately understood that the mentor had not asked him this question for no reason. She had personal experience on this matter. In the past, about 400 years ago, at the peak of the mentor's power, her persona was very popular, and her power was capable of performing any miracles. The teacher had the blood of dragons in her veins, which gave her such longevity and strength. Because of this, many people and the emperor himself personally entered into a contract with her, which stated that no races were to interfere in the affairs of humans. Needless to say, such an agreement became a catalyst for many conflicts and quarrels. It was after such an agreement that the non-humans moved to the demonic forest. But the fact is that the agreement was signed 400 years ago, and the people who supported it were dead. The last emperor had long since been in the ground, which once again reminded Jack that no matter how strong you were, time always got the better of anyone. But even after the agreement expired and the ban was lifted, other races could not get out of the forest. Many tried but were stopped. The dragons were bound by the shackles of this agreement for 2 more years, and in their anger they killed anyone who tried to leave the forest. No one could resist their prohibition. Those who could resist them were dead. The dragons were proud and vain. If they were forbidden to go out, then so were others. They did not let anyone out of sight. The law imposed by the mentor was still in effect when he had to kill all the dragons one by one. In the future, he had enough power to do so. In this life, he would like to avoid bloodshed and resolve everything peacefully. He could try to save them, and the girl could help him with this. The girl was already picking up her purchases. The simple-minded, smiling butcher stroked her head and handed her a bag. Jack didn't want the mentor to burden herself with responsibility. He took her hands, but the teacher coldly met this statement. What could this youth know about her? To which the guy replied that a lot. She still had not gotten used to his status. He was her student. They traveled together for 14 years. The teacher resignedly agreed with him. The teacher said one thing. Jack shouldn't have fed his blood. Jack didn't understand what exactly she meant. While they were talking, the girl disappeared. Jack came to the conclusion that he would later understand what the mentor wanted to say with this. She sometimes liked to speak in riddles. Now the guy will pay attention to his future ally. It occurred to him that he had not taken into account the vampire's childhood at all. He had completely forgotten that it was necessary to talk to children differently, to approach the issue from a different angle. He would start with food. Children usually love various delicacies, and Jack was going to treat the girl to a treat at the next meeting. The guy headed to the food stalls. The blonde kept thinking about her recent meeting with that guy at the market. She was inspired by the generosity of this man and imagined how everything would have turned out if she had answered differently. That young man probably wanted to see her as an assistant. Not that she could do much, but at least she received 1 shilling, and that was all he could wish for today. In her memory, such a contingent of people, kind and generous, was very rare. She had not seen such people for a long time. She held a container with a red liquid in her left hand. The vessel contained orc blood that she had bought in the city. The seller had been polite and kind to her. She hoped that if her mother drank this blood, she would feel better. Her mother had always told her, from the moment the girl was born, that they should not drink human blood. She repeated this constantly, but now her mother's strength was fading, and speech was difficult for her. In principle, she was forbidden to drink blood other than that which the girl's uncle gave her. She always tried to follow this rule and had never broken it. The girl hoped that at least today her uncle would honor her and her mother with his presence. The blonde opened the door of the house, announcing her arrival. The vampire carefully and quietly crept towards her mother's bedchamber, keeping the blood at the ready. She did not want to disturb her mother if she was sleeping. Mom was not sleeping and said that they had guests. Entering the room, Mom was lying in bed as usual. The emaciated and pale woman looked at her daughter with half-open eyes. Her hair gave off a silvery old woman's shine. She didn't notice the guests right away, when suddenly she heard a greeting from upstairs to her side. Jack politely asked the girl how long ago she had arrived. He himself was sitting on a dais near the door. Charlotte was frightened, spilling some of the liquid on the floor out of fear. She wondered how they could have ended up there. She had only seen this couple for the first time this afternoon. The teacher irritably demanded that the woman get out of bed normally and show them her face. The teacher was satisfied. She noted that decades had passed since their last meeting. But there was one thing the mentor could not understand. Why was a vampire of noble blood, Vivienne de Royale, living out her days in such a deplorable state in this backwater house? Jack and Charlotte were asked to leave the building and they waited outside. The young man watched as the vampire fed the birds. He did not understand why they were wasting their time and why Charlotte was bothering with the birds. The guy turned his gaze to the window, located on the second floor, where the mentor and the vampire Vivienne were now left alone. They were wasting time. Although everything could have been finished with mana, Jack hoped that nothing would happen. The mentor sat at the head of Vivienne's bed. The aristocrat herself could not remember what kind of figure was in front of her now. It looked like a little girl with long green hair. Maybe she was a vampire hunter. The mentor turned to Vivienne and looked her straight in the eyes. The vampire instantly remembered that the famous Valentine Milos, a truly legendary figure, was sitting in front of her. Valentine tried to refresh her friend's memory. Vivienne didn't remember anything. The mentor said that her entire family was forced to leave the forest. Something like that couldn't be forgotten. Something stirred in Vivienne's memory, but a sharp coughing fit made the girl bend over in pain. Valentine noticed that the vampire's condition was getting worse every minute. Vivienne remembered the sorceress as a grown and beautiful girl, and now a child was sitting in front of her. She asked what happened to her, to which Valentine told her about the curse, because of which only once a month she has the appearance of an adult. But the teacher felt that Vivienne wanted to jump out of answering the question, and did not let her do this, repeating it. And Valentine will not leave here until he gets answers. Why such a royal person, a member of noble blood and the vampire elite, would live her life in such a backwater? Valentine found all this suspicious. From Vivienne's condition, It was clear that she had not drunk human blood for a very long time, which meant that her life was in question. It was unclear why she had gone so far. The aristocrat responded with a counterattack. Did Valentine really feel sorry for her? A lot of time had passed since their last meeting, and they remembered the past. Last time Valentine instilled fear and terror in all creatures. She was an incredibly powerful sorceress and respected by all races. Valentine was full of life energy, but looking at her now, Vivian came to the conclusion that there was no trace left of the former liveliness. Inspiration had left her. Although back then, in the forest, she and the other vampires would not have made it out alive, the rabid fanatics wanted them dead, but Valentine protected them, and they were able to see a new day. Vivian decided to answer her question. The girl leaned back on the pillows of the bed and plunged into the pool of past memories, which she found unpleasant to pull out of there. In the demonic forest, there are 5 of the most powerful and dangerous creatures, which are commanded by 2 powerful lords, who give any, even the most cruel orders, at their whim. So the vampires tried to leave the forest. Their oppression was slowly exterminating the entire vampire nation. They then walked along the road in the hope of remaining unnoticed by the dragons. She had little Charlotte in her arms at the time, and she wanted a better life for her daughter, free from the cruelty and blood that the pair of lords were spreading in the forest. Traveling through the snowy desert with a baby in their arms was not an easy test. But nevertheless, they coped, reached the end, but danger awaited them ahead. No one could hide from the all-seeing gaze of the dragons. One of them intercepted the caravan, killing every vampire in it. Charlotte then cried terribly, and Vivian herself begged to spare her and the child. The dragon answered her that he felt sorry for them, and the red monster disappeared under the gentle clouds, saving their lives. It was a very terrible experience. Valentine was very surprised to hear such a thing from the dragon, but Vivian was telling the truth. He did not put any hex or other spell on them and left them alone. In this village, she and her daughter lived side by side with pigs, cows, and other animals. But nevertheless, it was a safe life, and she and her daughter managed. For a mother, the most important thing was the happiness and health of her child. And Vivian wanted to raise Charlotte in safety and love. These were small sacrifices for her. Valentine felt sorry for this girl. Vivian was one of the last in whom the blood of the rulers still flowed. She was an aristocrat, born to rule. But she lived in this remote and poor village in a land barely marked on the map of the continent. And worst of all, she was already waiting for her death. Jack was counting crows when Charlotte asked him impatiently when they would leave. The tone in which the blonde spoke seemed interesting to Jack, and he looked at the girl. Charlotte continued talking. She told them that their uncle was supposed to come to them soon, and he didn't like guests. The young man asked with interest what kind of uncle he was. Such a person, given the financial and physical situation of Charlotte and Vivian, was at least strange, plus his dislike of guests. Something was wrong here. Jack asked if Charlotte could tell him more about her relative. The young man had a strange, uneasy feeling about this uncle. At first, Charlotte was frightened. She thought that Jack wanted to get his love heart, and warned that Jack's body was of no interest to his uncle. Ballantyre irritably denied her speculations. He replied that he was simply very bored waiting for the conversation between the mentor and her mother to end, in which case Charlotte would not mind telling about her uncle. She wanted to tell so much that she didn't immediately know where to start. Her uncle was a rich and wealthy man who looked the part, but in fact, Charlotte did not have a lot of information. She only knew for sure that her uncle bought this house for her and her mother, and that he also brought them food every 3 days. When the girl spoke about food, Jack thought of the bowl of pig and cow blood that Charlotte was holding in her hands, and the young man immediately understood who his uncle really was. Jack had already started to tell Charlotte the truth. She and her mother were in danger, and Jack himself was embarrassed by Charlotte's ignorance, but he did not have time to finish the sentence. When a soft male voice cut through the street, the man asked if he was the one being talked about. The man was curious about Charlotte's new friend. Jack looked at him. The aristocrat was sitting on the fence. In his hands, he had a white cane with precious stones. The man's head was covered with long, snow-white hair with a silver sheen. A teardrop-shaped ruby was inlaid on his forehead. The stranger's eyes had a pinkish-yellow tint. He saw the guy in front of him for the first time. As soon as Charlotte noticed him, his eyes lit up with a playful fire, and she happily greeted her uncle. Jack greeted the man, noting that he was probably that same uncle. The stranger only needed one look at Jack to understand that he was in the presence of a nobleman. The man grinned and carefully examined the young Ballantyre. The whole appearance of this stranger simply screamed about his origin. In front of Jack stood a dragon in human form. The aristocrat inquired about the reason for his presence in their modest home. The dragon sensed the presence of another stranger in the house. He noted with some disapproval that there were many guests in their house today. The man headed into the house. Vivian felt the presence of the dragon when she and Valentine were finishing their conversation. The vampire asked the sorceress to call her daughter from the street. She had a bad feeling. The dragon noted that they had many guests today. Now it was clear why this man did not like guests. Jack did not like him. Dragons themselves were cruel and vain. The mentor spoke to him through a mental connection. He warned her about the approach of a man. Valentine told him to bring this man and Charlotte to them. The whispers that Jack responded with made the dragon nervous, although he could hear some of the words the boy was saying. But Jack submitted to the will of his mentor. Balantier approached the oak door and took hold of the handle. He answered the dragon that his teacher was waiting for them. The dragons were cruel. They were bored with just killing. They sometimes wanted to play with the victim. The guy asked him to come into the house. The dragon followed him to the second floor to the bedroom. Jack gave the dragon a cold look. The man was amused by this whole situation. Young Balantier said that if he wanted to talk to his toy, he should hurry up. Vivian was still lying in bed, turned towards the window. Hearing them approaching, Vivian prepared to take her daughter into a tight embrace. But looking at the doorway, she was horrified. The dragon was standing next to her daughter and stroking her head. The dragon chuckled at this reaction as if Vivian had seen a ghost. He said that he just came to chat and sat down on a chair near the bed, but his intentions were not good. In an instant, from a calm and smiling face, the dragon with a bloodthirsty grin promised not to make a scandal before her death. He was pleased with the pleasure that the toy gave him. Charlotte's mother's face suddenly turned even paler. The daughter ran to her mother and tried to find out what had happened to her, why she had gotten worse. Vivian, breathing heavily, only repeated her name. In a panic, the girl said that she had orc blood, which could improve her mother's condition. The daughter hoped that her mother would be able to get up and talk to her again. But Vivian refused. She only said that she had prepared a gift for her birthday. She gathered all her strength and smiled at her daughter for the last time. She apologized with tears in her eyes for everything that Charlotte had to go through because of her, for the fact that she could not give her daughter a better life. She was so weak that she could not even give a gift. Vivian gently touched her daughter's cheek as her hand began to crack and crumble, even more like broken stone. Charlotte looked at her dying mother in panic. Initially, neither Jack nor his mentor were supposed to witness this scene. Valentine even looked away from this heartbreaking picture. Jack ran into her by chance and followed her out of curiosity. He had no reason to keep an eye on this girl. He was only going to gather his comrades. But looking at this, he decided to change his views a little. He approached the dying aristocrat and asked her if she would entrust her daughter's life into his hands. Although he had no reason to do so initially, he would create one now. Vivian thought Jack was joking, but he replied that they had little time. He took Vivian by the hand and moved on to the confusion. He looked into the vampire's eyes and asked what she wanted for her child. The guy's face was extremely serious, and Vivian did not doubt the power of his words and promises. Whether she wanted Charlotte to become a full-fledged vampire, or whether she wanted the entire continent and the entire world to lie at her daughter's feet, what she was about to say was very important. Or perhaps Vivian wants revenge for the fallen lives of all vampires, and to kill the ill-fated dragon. The man watched the performance in front of him with a smile and interest. Vivian replied that she really wanted a different, happier fate for her daughter. Like every mother, she wanted her child to be safe and happy. Vivian had nothing to wish for except this thing. She directed her clouded, faded eyes at Jack, the last energy leaving her. She would only be able to say a few words. Her most important wish was for her daughter to always smile. She couldn't even dream of more. Charlotte shouldn't have to go through all the hardships that Vivian went through. But before her death, she would like to know the guy's name. In the process of communication, she completely forgot about this detail. The nobleman introduced himself as Jack Balantier, a fine name for such a young man. Vivian liked it. She asked if he could protect her beloved and dear Charlotte. Vivian's face began to crack. Jack replied that he gave his word that the representative of noble vampire blood, Vivian, with the veins of the blood of true rulers, rest in peace. She thanked him for his promise. The aristocrat called her daughter. Vivian wanted to touch her Charlotte for the last time, let her know that her mother would always love her. She touched the girl's face and pieces began to fall off her hand. Vivian began to collapse, and Charlotte rushed to her sobbing. She kept begging her not to close her eyes. The girl did not want to acknowledge the death of her mother. Screams could be heard everywhere. Charlotte continued to cry over her mother's body, which was slowly dissolving into thin air. How would she live without her? Only one word was heard from the house. Louder than all, Mom, Jack, and Valentine watched silently. The room was filled with the loud, heart-rending laughter of the dragon. He grabbed his head from laughter and could not stop. This whole picture amused him very much. Even in death, his toy made his owner happy. The man could barely contain his laughter. It seemed that he was about to die from it. Words of revenge and happiness were heard in this room. He was amused by the responsibility that the boy took for the girl's life. The girl was about to die soon as well. It felt like the little brat's life was worth something. The dragon burst into laughter again as Jack concentrated his magic and lunged at the dragon. The dragon's body broke through the wall of their house, and there was a small bruise on its neck. The man didn't even have time to figure out what had just happened to him, but he enjoyed this fun. The dragon decided to have some fun with the boy. He sarcastically noted that attacking a defenseless person is a sign of bad manners. The man landed on the street floor with the agility of a cat. Arcs and streams of fire began to dance around the dragon. Flames engulfed the man's body. His eyes acquired a pure white set. Jack prepared for the fight. The battle promised to be difficult. The dragon, in his madness, was obliged to teach Jack a lesson in good manners. He was already preparing to attack. His hand reached out to Jack, his claws extended, when suddenly a voice in his head ordered him to name himself.